the suspicious origins of the COVID-19 pandemic and associated crisis. I'm Kevin Barrett, and with me are a number of distinguished panelists. We're going to be beginning with Francis Boyle by video. We'll move on to Ron Unz, Barry Kissin, Merrill Nass, and Thomas Wilcuts, and I'll introduce them in more detail when we get to their sections of the webinar. This is an interactive webinar, so we will be taking questions and answers after the two presentations in the first part, and then again after the three presentations in the second part of the webinar. We'll have a Q&A session, and people can either raise their hands, if you can figure out how to do that, if you are one of the attendees in this webinar, and you could actually come on camera and have your face and your words preserved for posterity. Or if you prefer to ask your questions by simply typing them, you can do that too by the Q&A window. So let's get moving and explore this. Let me just introduce myself and why I'm here. I got into the conspiracy business thanks to 9/11, and now I can't leave thanks to COVID-19. I would love to become a retired conspiracy theorist, but I can't retire for the same reason Sarah Moore can't retire from mocking Trump. They just won't stop feeding us material. Apparently, the people who want to shut down the conspiracy theories have figured out that they haven't figured out actually that the best way to do that would be to shut down the conspiracies. And so the conspiracy sector continues to boom even more than Amazon and Walmart, where everything else is being wiped out. So it looks like we're rushing into a headlong, wonderful future for conspiracy theories while the rest of the world goes to hell in a proverbial handbasket. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work here and start with Professor Francis Boyle, who made worldwide alternative media headlines not too long ago by saying that in his view, COVID-19 is clearly a bioweapon, and he thinks it might have escaped from the Wuhan lab. Professor Boyle is a leading American practitioner of international law. He helped draft the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act, which applied the Biological Weapons Convention back in 1972. He's a professor at the University of Illinois Champaign, has a Doctor of Law as well as PhD from Harvard University. And let's roll his video and see what Professor Francis Boyle has to say about this topic.
I think I found the smoking gun here. There was a recent scientific study published in Antiviral Research, 10 February 2020, by 3 scientists from France and 1 from Montreal, who did a genetic analysis of the Wuhan coronavirus, and they said, quote, "It may provide a gain of function of the 219 coronavirus for efficient spreading in the human population compared to other viruses." Let me repeat that. May provide a gain of function to the 2019 coronavirus for efficient spreading in the human population compared to other lineage coronaviruses. That's the smoking gun for a offensive biological warfare agent. Gain of function properties is a tip-off. It's only useful for offensive biological warfare activity, and it is typically conducted in either it's so dangerous, in either a BSL-4 or a BSL-3 facility, and there in Wuhan you have the only BSL-4 facility in China. So I think it's clear it came out of this lab. Gain of function, means it's DNA genetically engineered to be more lethal and more more infectious. Clearly what we're seeing now with this coronavirus, it is basically SARS, which is already a weaponized version of a coronavirus that has leaked out of that laboratory at least twice before. and then it is given gain of function properties, which basically means it can travel by air for at least 6 feet and is more lethal. SARS lethality was about 10%. Lancet estimates here the lethality is about 15%. If you disaggregate Chinese government figures, it's about 17%. And there's a British public health authority who said he thinks it's about 18%. So I think that's a fair and accurate statement. Second, we have an article here from the NatMed, 2015, December 21. SARS-like cluster of circulating back coronases show potential for human emergence. This was at the University of North Carolina. In Chapel Hill. They have a biosafety lab level 3 there, and I have previously condemned them for using gain of function work on MERS, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. It is like SARS, only more dangerous. It has a 33% lethality rate. And they were doing gain of function work there to make it even more lethal. Well, it turns out if you read the article, they admit that they were doing this with SARS, that they were giving it a gain of function activity. And it turns out part of their team was a researcher from China, Zheng Li Shi, Key Laboratory of Special Pathogens and Biosafety, Wuhan Institute of Virology, Chinese Academy of Sciences. And they gave a grant to the University of North Carolina to get their scientists in on this extremely dangerous Nazi-type biological warfare work. So it appears that what happened was, instead of stealing this technology, China bought it. And they bought it from the lab there at the University of North Carolina. They put their person in there. They took the technology and they brought it back to the Wuhan lab. It's right there. This fellow works for the Wuhan lab. And it also appears that the North Carolina lab got cells from Fort Detrick, which is the U.S. Major facility for the research, development, testing, stockpiling of biological weapons. Fort Detrick is the U.S. equivalent of Porton Down. So that's where they got some of their cells here. And they made it clear the work that they were doing was to increase the pathogenicity of original SARS by giving it this gain of function activity. The final piece of evidence here is Archive of Virology 2010. And this is research done with the Australian Animal Health Laboratory and again, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they DNA genetically engineered SARS and HIV, okay, to make a weapon. And they got a grant here from the Chinese Ministry of Science, Technology, et cetera, to do this. So once again, they bought the technology. They didn't steal it back to Wuhan. And so my reading of these articles, basically, these 3 articles, is that they took the technology from this death factory at North Carolina. They took the technology from this Australian research project. They brought it back to the Wuhan BSL-4 and tried to genetically engineer it all together as a sort of a turbocharged biological warfare weapon that would consist of SARS, which is already a weaponized coronavirus, gain of function properties, and HIV. And as you know, those Indian scientists already did an analysis of the coronavirus, and it was published online. I read it, and HIV was clearly in there, AIDS, that gives AIDS. I saw the pictures. So that, I think, is what we are dealing with here. We've never seen, at least released in the public, a biological warfare agent this dangerous, except the Amerithrax that was in October 2001 after the 9/11 2001 terrorist attacks. That was super weapons grade anthrax, 100 grams of spore. It too traveled in the air. It seemed to be based on nanotechnology. And we hadn't seen any. And at the time, I publicly stated it came out of U.S. biological warfare weapons program and probably Fort Detrick, which was later confirmed. I said that about the first week in November. I was even on the BBC saying that. And then an order was given to silence me. I was blackballed off all mainstream news media in the United States, Britain, Europe, you name it. So despite the fact my viewpoints are all over the world, no mainstream news media will touch me. So the Amerithrax, of course, was extremely dangerous, but not as infectious as what we're seeing here. So in a nutshell, that's where I see it as of today.
Okay, so that's Professor Francis Boyle of the University of Illinois. We should note that a few days ago, the Chinese government said that their investigation has shown that this virus did not come out of any Wuhan biolaboratory and that it did not come from the wet market. So what are the other possibilities? Ron Unz, the editor-in-chief of the Unz Review, a leading alternative media outlet, has some ideas that he's going to share with us. He's the author of an article called American Pravda, Our Coronavirus Catastrophe is Biowarfare Blowback. That article got a huge number of reads, 1,000 some comments. And 1 week after it was published, suddenly the Unz Review was blacklisted from Google, right on top of a recent blacklisting from Facebook. And many of us wonder whether that's a coincidence. In any case, Ron Unz is a theoretical physicist by training. He's got degrees from Harvard, Cambridge, and Stanford. He's founded a successful company in the financial services software sector. He's gotten involved in public policy writing and politics, and he's been oscillating between those two interests ever since. And I think we can safely call him a towering figure in alternative media, if that isn't an oxymoron. So let's listen to Ron Unz. Welcome, Ron. It's great to have you.
Well, thanks very much for being here. What I guess I'd like to say is that I'm something of a fairly recent person to get involved with what might be called conspiracy movements or conspiracy theories. And to be honest, I think sometimes somebody from the outside can see things that people who've been involved in that world for a long time might be so used to that they might miss. And for example, when the whole when the outbreak of this disease took place originally in China, I guess I started reading about it in the headlines in early to mid January, and it started getting more and more attention, with the Chinese government feeling it was so serious that they needed to lock down their entire city of Wuhan, a city of 11 million people, and then lock down the entire province. It really shocked me. In other words, we were talking about an outbreak of enormous proportions and potentially tremendous danger for the world. And it was only probably a little bit after that when I started really looking into it a little bit, I discovered that there were all of these websites, generally right-wing conspiracy websites, that started talking very fervently about the notion of the virus being a leak from a biological research lab at Wuhan, very much along the lines of what Francis Boyle just mentioned. in his talk. And I guess it was one of the elements that sort of sparked that discussion. And one of the strange things that struck me at the point of when I found out this sort of discussion was widespread in portions of the alternative media is that it really didn't seem to make any sense at all, the notion of a laboratory leak. I mean, just on a very simple basis, leaving aside all the scientific issues, which I'll sort of give an overview in a moment, when we're talking about one thing that the media had repeatedly emphasized in the New York pages of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that I was reading every morning was that this outbreak of a mysterious virus had struck China at the exact worst possible moment. In other words, it had occurred in Wuhan, which was a major transportation hub, just prior to the Lunar New Year, when hundreds of millions of Chinese might be traveling throughout the country, going home to their families and, basically going on their annual holiday. And so, as the articles in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal always emphasized, an outbreak like that occurring at that moment in time had a very high likelihood, it seemed, of spreading throughout the entire country and infecting all of Chinese society. Now, the problem with hypothesizing that the leak had, that sort of bioweapon that had leaked accidentally from the Wuhan lab, is that an accidental leak obviously would occur at a random point of time in the year. And it just seemed to me really very doubtful that a random leak of the sort discussed would occur at the absolute worst possible time from the point of view of China and spreading throughout the entire country. So, that just made me somewhat suspicious. And then the truth is, as I found out how widely the notion of a biological warfare weapon from the Wuhan lab was being propagated around the alternative media, it made me very suspicious of where it was coming from. Because, the truth is, at that point in time, mid to late January, only a few Americans were paying much attention to that particular outbreak in China. In other words, it was an important worldwide issue and a Chinese issue, but not really something that impacted ordinary American lives. And it just seemed for suddenly so many figures in the alternative media, the conspiracy movement, conspiracy websites, or anti-Chinese promoters, like, for example, Steve Bannon, to be unified in promoting the notion of a biological weapons leak in a Chinese research lab in Wuhan, and doing so in such an energetic, coordinated fashion, struck me as really quite suspicious. In other words, normally you would expect something like that to gradually propagate around and a few people getting an idea, promoting it, arguing about it. But it suddenly seemed to leap almost full grown into those segments of the alternative media. And in fact, the clip you just showed by Francis Boyle, which I hadn't seen before, I'd sort of vaguely heard about it, seems to sort of go along with that point, because we have Boyle, as far as I know, isn't really a scientist. He's more a law professor, but who has been involved in many times, arguing about biological weapons and taking a very strong position of that, and with a lot of credibility in certain elements of the alternative media. And suddenly he was sort of apparently presented with these articles, which seemed to argue that the mysterious disease in China had come about from a biological warfare leak in their laboratory, and ended up, as far as I can see from the small segment, talking about various scientific issues and the fact that the virus involved would have a 15 to 20% mortality rate. Incredibly deadly, which just seems to me extremely implausible at the time. And it seems to me that somebody probably therefore made an effort to get him on record as saying those things. So just stepping back a little bit, I guess what I'm saying is, it seems to me a little bit strange at such an early stage there would be such a heavy barrage of attempts to promote this as a biological weapons leak from China. And, as the evidence started coming out a little bit more, and, obviously the facts ended up being very, very different than what Boyle suggested. In other words, the fatality rate, everybody now agrees, is between 0.5% and 1%. It seems to me that that was intended to sort of produce a sort of atmosphere where if people started looking at the possible origins of this mysterious virus in China, they would naturally be diverted into the sense of it being a Chinese biological warfare leak that occurred in their own country. Now, at the time I started looking into the issue, I browsed around a little bit, and whereas the anti-China framework was apparently very early, released in a very early fashion, very widespread, very dominant, when I started trying to find facts to present a slightly different picture, it was a question of like finding very obscure writings on small websites by fringe people and simply looking at the facts that they presented. Now, when you step back a little bit, what we're really talking about is, the truth is, when you see an outbreak of a strange new virus in a country, and that sort of thing, the likelihood of it having been from, for example, China's own biological warfare lab seems really, quite low to me, because when you look at, for example, the evidence that's come out, including some internal Chinese documents, there's no sense that the Chinese government had any awareness of what was going on. There was a mysterious illness that they at first thought was connected with the sort of market for animals right towards the end of December. And then towards the beginning of January and mid-January, they found out it could involve human-to-human propagation. And it was only around that point that the Chinese government even started being aware of what was going on. And, obviously, if there were any evidence that one of their own biological warfare weapons had leaked from their laboratory, the likelihood of their reacting in a much faster and more extreme thing would probably be a lot higher. So I guess what I'm saying is there seems to be a tremendous amount of smoke floating around on some of these issues. And then when you step back and look at the facts, the truth is a lot of these scientific issues involved really tend to be obviously the sort that can be interpreted in many different ways. For example, there are hundreds and hundreds of papers right now being written, obviously, or attempted to be written on these sorts of issues. There's a tremendous amount of smoke on both sides and, going back and forth. But it seems to me stepping back from these questions of disputed science, where you can find one paper that says one thing, another paper says another thing, it's probably much better to look at the simple facts, which really are fairly undeniable. One of them is that, and this is something I hadn't been aware of until, I saw it in a small paper that somebody had written on a small website, but China's leading source of meat tends to be swine, pigs. And in 1999, they suffered a tremendous epidemic of swine flu that came and destroyed 40% of their entire herd, wiped out a lot of their meat source. And so, the year before, they'd suffered avian flu, and a lot of their poultry had been annihilated. And then now, in late 2019, they suddenly, a mysterious virus appeared that, while it had a very low fatality rate, would have a very large economic impact rate to the extent that they were forced to shut down their entire country. So anyway, the point I guess I'm making is that it's important to check through the pattern of events. And then as I started noticing the way, for example, this particular disease was spreading around the world, obviously, it started off in China, and you'd naturally expect it to hit the East Asian countries next. And in fact, there were some small outbreaks, for example, in Japan, some small outbreaks in other East Asian countries. It seemed to me very, very suspicious that the next largest outbreak actually took place in Iran, on the other side of the world, with relatively small connections to China. Obviously, some Chinese work in Iran, there's some travel, but on the list of major countries in the world, Iran would be very, very far down the list of any expected source of an outbreak. And yet it very quickly became the second largest outbreak in the world, the second most extreme outbreak. In particular, hitting the Iranian elites, with 10% of the Iranian parliament being infected very early on, and a dozen or more senior figures in the Iranian political world being infected, with some of them dying, a dozen of them dying of that sort of thing. So the truth is, when you're looking at a pattern of events, instead of worrying about things that are subject to widespread dispute where you can get experts on both sides arguing, I think it makes much more sense simply to focus on where things hit and who's affected by it. At that time, at the point when China was hit, China was in the midst of a tremendous economic conflict with the United States. I mean, relations were at a very bad stage. We were doing everything we could to sort of weaken China's position. And in fact, just over a year before, we'd actually kidnapped the CFO of China's most important technology company, Huawei, when she was changing planes in Canada and trying to get her to be prosecuted on trade issues with Iran. So the point is basically, at a point of very serious conflict with the United States, China was suddenly hit with this mysterious new virus that forced China to shut down its entire economy. And at the time, it looked very unlikely that China would be able to control the outbreak. But by locking down up to 700 million people, the largest lockdown in the history of the world, a quarantine probably 1,000 times larger than anything in the history of the world, China was able to stamp down the disease. And at the same time, the other country that America was so incredibly hostile towards at that point, and in fact, just a few weeks earlier, we'd assassinated one of the top leaders of that country, General Soleimani. Suddenly, there was an outbreak of that exact same viral illness targeting Iran's top political elites, which seemed extremely suspicious to me. Another factor, which actually just came out a little bit later, and really seems very inexplicable from any other position, is that, given the important nature of this illness and the tremendous, impact it's had on the United States and other countries now as it leaked into the West, obviously there's been a tremendous amount of coverage in the American media of the timeline of this illness breaking out in China and exactly when the Chinese government became aware of it. In fact, many criticisms of the Chinese government, in a sense, paid little attention to it at first, even though, the evidence is on the other side. But the whole thing about it is that there's absolutely no evidence that the Chinese government had any awareness of the illness until right towards the end of December, and more really towards the beginning and early mid-January, when the government obviously suddenly realized there was the possibility of human-to-human transmissions and obviously had to clamp down on it in a very strong way. The odd thing that then happened just a couple of months ago was that because of the fact that it spread to the United States and has obviously inflicted tremendous economic and damage on the United States, with over 100,000 Americans already dying because of our failure to react in a timely fashion, obviously there was tremendous pressure on the American government to explain that they weren't sleeping. They weren't asleep at the wheel when all of this happened. And what ended up then happening is ABC News ran a very interesting article based on 4 separate intelligence sources, saying that no, American intelligence had been on top of it from the very beginning. And in fact, the Defense Intelligence Agency, a unit of the Defense Intelligence Agency, had actually distributed a report to top US officials and also all of our NATO allies and the government of Israel, talking about a cataclysmic disease outbreak taking place in the city of Wuhan in China, with some risk of it possibly spreading to American military forces in East Asia, which was the focal point at that point. Now, the odd thing about that report is it was actually published and distributed in late November, over a month before any evidence that anybody in the Chinese government was even aware of it. In fact, since one key thing about this disease is that it's extremely contagious and it grows exponentially quickly under normal conditions, given the size of the outbreak in China and the rapidity with which it was spreading, we can actually isolate when the outbreak probably first took place, when patient 0 probably would have occurred in the city of Wuhan. And it probably would have been right towards the end of October, or more likely right towards the beginning of November. In other words, long before anybody in the Chinese government would become aware of it. There were a few dozen people infected, for example, by mid-December, by late December, early January, when the issue suddenly became significant. So for that reason, the fact that the US government and intelligence agency had already publicly distributed a document to all of our allies talking about a cataclysmic disease outbreak taking place in Wuhan, and did so in late November, before anybody really in the city of Wuhan was even aware of what was going on, is an extremely suspicious development. And it simply, look, the truth about it is different countries have all spent a great deal of time and effort over the years developing and researching biological weapons, various different sorts. And the notion, for example, of, a weapon like this having been used is obviously incredibly shocking and, horrific. But the truth is, it is the particular virus involved, even though it has a very low lethality rate. Obviously, the fact that it spreads so easily and so rapidly makes it a very powerful weapon aimed at damaging or crippling an economy, which is what we've now discovered in the United States, obviously, because of these circumstances. So for that reason, the notion of, for example, it being deployed against China, while it would be an extremely reckless and dangerous escalation to take, certainly would not at all be impossible. And in fact, one of the other extremely suspicious items which came out at the time is that the city of Wuhan during late October had been the site of the International Military Games, and 300 American military officers had participated in those games and visited Wuhan, probably did some sightseeing and that sort of thing. So the notion, for example, of this mysterious viral outbreak taking place in a city right after 300 American military officers visited is obviously, an extremely suspicious occurrence. Now, one interesting aspect of this whole story is that while the American alternative media was filled very, very early on with all of these stories of a viral leak from the Chinese Wuhan lab, all this really rampant speculation, most of which had very little evidence behind it, the side of China really was extremely behind the curve on all of these propaganda issues. And in fact, for example, as far as I know, until we ended up publishing an article which pointed out the issue of the 300 American military officers having visited Wuhan right at the time the viral leak occurred in that city, I think really there was no mention of it anywhere in the American media, on virtually any website, until we ended up republishing an article, and it ended up getting 80,000 or 90,000 page views very rapidly. It became promoted. And in fact, it was only about a month or two after that that the Chinese government started raising that issue. So it seems to me, again, if you have any indication that you are to blame, that the guilt is yours, that the virus has something to do with something that you produced in your laboratories, it would obviously be very natural to produce cover stories and propaganda at a very early stage and have it ready to go. While there's no sign of that anything of that sort happened from the Chinese government itself. So, for that reason, it just seems to me that the balance of evidence, which I could get into, and unfortunately, I've been a little bit scattered in my discussion here, but there's a great deal of material which I've covered at length in my article on that point. The science, I think, is very contradictory. In other words, you have some researchers who would argue that there's strong evidence of it being a bioweapon or possibly even genetically engineered bioweapon, others on the other side. But more looking at the pattern of events, who was hit? China and Iran, the Iranian political elites. The attack, the outbreak in China occurred at the worst possible time from China's point of view, in a major transit hub right before the Lunar New Year holidays. And the fact that, for example, 300 American military officers had been visiting that city beforehand, the fact that the American government was aware of the outbreak, long before the Chinese government. All of those facts together, I think, make it really quite likely that it was a biowarfare attack against China and the Chinese economy, probably by the deep state neocons or other rogue elements of the American national security apparatus.
Thank you, Ron. That's a very good, succinct presentation of a terrifying but all too plausible hypothesis. So this that leads us to ask ourselves, what would be the motives for this? To what extent would this have been a completely insane idea to use such an infectious weapon to attack an adversary with whom you have lots of travel links, and so the chances of blowback obviously would have been quite extreme. And so if you're right, the people that did this would be the most insanely reckless military strategists in all of human history, as far as I can tell. But I wouldn't put that past them, frankly, having studied 9/11 for nearly 2 decades now. So I believe we have a PowerPoint for my presentation, which is scheduled next. And after I go through that presentation, we'll get into the Q&A for half an hour before moving on to hear from Barry Kissin, Merrill Nass, and Thomas Wilcuts. So at this point, I think hopefully we've got the PowerPoint queuing up. There it is. So I published an article at the UNS Review, which raised some of the same issues that we just heard about from Ron, but in the framework of comparing this corona crisis to the 9/11 crisis. And there are so many interesting points of comparison that I don't even have time to really do justice to all of them. But if we move on to the next slide, I can quickly go through an abbreviated list and explain that this is why the whole thing struck me as so suspicious, since I was shocked by the evidence that 9/11 was a false flag in late 2003, investigated that, and have been kind of on that issue ever since. So let's look at these parallels. First, the result of these catastrophes is mass hysteria. We're seeing, people using masks as almost religious totems. I'm not saying the masks are not effective, but the emotional reaction is quite similar to what we saw after 9/11 with the fear of terrorists. And then the anthrax aspect of the 9/11 anthrax event, we had a period of fear of germs as well, which we're seeing again now. But that fear of germs has now gone off the charts. So the population has been terrorized, and they have flocked behind the mainstream explanation of things in many ways, just like after 9/11. Our second point of comparison is that 9/11 unleashed the clash of civilizations against the Islamic world, and this COVID crisis seems to be accelerating the clash of civilizations against the Chinese world. Of course, the clash of civilizations hypothesis was created by the arch-Zionist Bernard Lewis, and then popularized by Samuel Huntington in the 1990s to explain what would be the next threat. Where would we be fighting in the future? And he did pick Islam as the first adversary. Now it looks like China may be the second. A third point of comparison with 9/11 and COVID here is that both of them were very convenient for bailing out the biggest banksters. There was a dot-com collapse at the end of the 90s that was threatening not just the world economy, but the big financial houses that own and run it. And the QE started getting pumped out in August of 2001. A whistleblower from Chicago Stock Exchange contacted me at some point and went into great detail on this, never wanted to go public or use his name. Likewise here, we had a debt crisis that's been mounting for quite some time. Some measure, the quadrillions of dollars in derivatives. And how many quadrillion depends on who you talk to. But there was clearly a debt crisis. Many analysts were predicting a financial crunch, maybe the mother of all financial crunches, even before this corona crisis hit. And once again, just like with 9/11, we've suddenly been diverted from the shenanigans of the financial elite, and now they're being allowed to print as much money as they want. And of course, something similar happened again in 2008 between these two crises. Another point of comparison is the insider trading and put options suggesting there was foreknowledge of both of these crises. The 9/11 Commission report essentially admitted that there was foreknowledge of 9/11, but that as represented by put options, bets against American United Airlines and Morgan Stanley Dean Whittier, among other companies in the Trade Center, but that we shouldn't worry about it because it wasn't Al-Qaeda that bought those put options. That's pretty much verbatim what the 9/11 Commission said. And likewise with the Corona crisis, we're seeing also plenty of indications of insider trading, not least of all from a certain Larry Fink of the Blackstone Group, which has now essentially been handed the keys to the U.S. Treasury with as much QE, that means as much free money to print as they want. Another point of comparison next down the list is this windfall for the terror industrial complex after 9/11 parallels the windfall for the biowar medical industrial complex with the Corona crisis. And those two complexes are not entirely separate. The biowar component of the terror industrial complex after 9/11, which was, they had a little anthrax publicity stunt going for them. They actually had their budget raised by 7-fold after the anthrax attacks. And we went from, I think, 2 level 4 biolabs in the United States to something like 70 odd level 4 biolabs now. And so I guess the bioweaponeers are doing very well off both 9/11 anthrax and COVID, but they're really doing well from COVID. Another point of comparison, the anthrax attack component of the 9/11 affair, that fell apart. The cover story completely fell apart, as Graham McQueen explains in his book, The 2001 Anthrax Deception. And the COVID cover story about the origin seems to be falling apart as well. Nobody can find patient 0. There are all sorts of indications that people may have had COVID in different places earlier than they could have if it really came from the Wuhan lab or the wet market. And the Chinese now tell us it wasn't the Wuhan lab and the wet market, just like the FBI told us after the anthrax attacks that it actually came from an American germ warfare lab, not from Saddam Hussein plus Al-Qaeda, as the perpetrators of the 9/11 anthrax false flag clearly had scripted. And read Dr. McQueen's book, Graham McQueen's book on that for the details. So next point of comparison, we're seeing a huge censorship epidemic in the wake of coronavirus, just like we did after 9/11. After 9/11, dissent was unpatriotic. Dan Rather said, if you say anything that's unapproved, you're going to have a flaming tire put around your neck, like they used to do in South Africa. And post-COVID, it's the same thing. If you're dissenting, you're a threat to the public health and you need to be quarantined. So there's this huge wave of censorship crashing down on us, as of course the Uns Review just got blacklisted from both Facebook and Google. That's just one example. There are hundreds. So next point of comparison, the surveillance state is going crazy, just like it did post 9/11. The Patriot Act, which was rammed through Congress after anthrax, U.S. government anthrax, was mailed to Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy, of course, created a whole new world in the United States, where now the national security state can basically spy on anybody, anywhere, anytime, as they've been doing for quite some time. Snowden, among others, reminded us of that. And now the surveillance state is going to go into even higher gear, with contact tracing being the excuse. So now they actually don't even have to apologize or hide the fact that they're tracking everybody's cell phones, and they know everybody, not only who's calling each other, but who's walking past each other in public places. So the contact tracing thing is the greatest boon to the surveillance state in history. And then finally, that wasn't just an accident, it was foreseen. Just as 9/11 was predicted and scripted practically, if you look at the documents before 9/11 that basically announced what they were going to do, you see the same thing happening with lockstep and Event 201 forecasting the Corona crisis. With 9/11, we had Philip Zelikow, who later became 9/11 Commission czar, publishing an article with John Deutsch in 1998 in the Foreign Affairs magazine, exploring the likely psychological and cultural and historical consequences of a massive terror attack on the United States, such as the destruction of the World Trade Center. That was a pretty good forecast from Zelikow. PNAC, Project for a New American Century, put out Rebuilding America's Defenses, telling us we needed a new Pearl Harbor to get what they wanted, which was preemptive war in the Middle East and a huge ramp up of the security state. And then, of course, we had the 46 drills around 9/11. That is 46 drills, about 25 or so on that day itself, making September 11th, 2001, the biggest pre-announced national security special event day in American history. Again, this whole thing was basically pre-announced. They didn't even try to hide it. And then they demolished Building 7 after a countdown that went out over police radio and after the upcoming demolition had been announced actually on a radio station, according to several people who heard it. So they tell us what they're going to do with Corona. It was lockstep back 10 years ago that told us exactly what how this Corona thing globally was going to play out, and Event 201 just from last year. So these points of comparison are so kind of extreme that you have to be a crazy coincidence theorist not to become a conspiracy theorist. So let's move on to the next slide here. If we're going to investigate this Corona pandemic, I guess we can simplify our investigative flowchart a little bit. And I underlined in red what strike me as the more likely possibilities here. Is it natural or was it made in a lab? Well, Francis Boyle thinks made in a lab. And what we just heard from Ron Unz suggests that it also sounds like a biological weapon. So let's go with the circumstantial evidence there and move over to the next question. Well, if it was made in a lab, was it an accidental release or was it deliberately unleashed? And once again, we heard from Ron that the deliberate hypothesis has a bit more presumptive weight. So let's move on to the next level. If somebody released this deliberately, who could they be? Well, one way the national security types like to think about this, state actors versus non-state actors. Frankly, I think that may be a slightly fuzzy dichotomy. In any case, if it were state actors, the two prime suspects, I don't know why the Chinese would be considered prime suspects, but in a recent poll, 40% of British people say that they think China unleashed the coronavirus in order to destroy the Western economies. And I think they're getting that propaganda probably in their mass media. But for those of us who know anything about the strategic situation, that's a pretty ludicrous hypothesis because China wins its struggle with the West simply by continuing on the path that it's on without any catastrophes. The last thing it wants is a big catastrophe. The USA, however, is another story. And the hypotheses of a US deliberate attack would be that either it was a botched attack on China and Iran, as Ron suggested in his presentation in his article, or one could say perhaps they suspected or even knew that it was going to go global and cause the damage worldwide, including here in the West, that it has, in which case we could imagine that state actors might have done a successful global reset operation for reasons I'll be getting into. And if it were non-state actors, the first possibility would be small-time terrorist gangsters, cults, some crazy mad scientist with his basement lab, and so on. Sounds unlikely. The motive wouldn't be clear. And big operations usually are done by motivated people with means, motive, and opportunity. So it's probably more likely it would be the big-time oligarchs, that is the international deep state, which would be doing it to consolidate power. Now, I would argue for some combination of the USA as a state actor and the oligarchical international deep state, which really owns the US government. If we read John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman, we learn that the banksters that Perkins worked for were paying him as well as quote unquote CIA assassins to work their mayhem, are a kind of international deep state that basically owns and operates the so-called US government. So let's move on to the next slide and pursue this a little further. If we take a cui bono approach and ask who's been profiting from these possible false flags, 9/11 leads us first to the bankster QE beneficiaries, the people whose financial interests were threatened on 9/11 by the dot-com crunch. And with COVID, we have the same people essentially being bailed out by yet another massive crisis. Okay, who else profited? Well, on 9/11, we had the military industrial complex having its budget practically doubled overnight. And then the biowar industrial complex having its budget increased sevenfold overnight. So that was quite a set of beneficiaries as well. And here with the Corona crunch, we see the medical industrial complex, as well as the biowar complex, which is part of it, also reaping a huge windfall. With 9/11, Israel is an obvious beneficiary. We're not supposed to say that. I'm expecting to be cut off at any moment, even for breathing the word. But you really can't study 9/11 without noticing that geopolitically, 9/11 looks like it was scripted to help Israel achieve everything that it said it needed with Netanyahu's clean break document of 1996. And likewise with COVID, the geopolitical issue points us more at a US national security state being the beneficiary. Among other beneficiaries, there were the CIA drug lords, who were, of course, a huge player in the international deep state. The CIA has dominated international drug trafficking and the money laundering associated with it since World War II. And that group, of course, made a lot of money by, what did they do after 9/11? The first thing they did was invaded Afghanistan, set free the drug lords, and told them to start planting opium. And the shutdown of the opium and heroin industries that the Taliban had affected before that suddenly was reversed. And within 2 years, Afghanistan was setting records year after year for opium production, in the same way that Vietnam and the Golden Triangle had been pumping out opium to the world through the CIA proprietary airline during the Vietnam era. I don't think it's any coincidence that these long, protracted wars in places where there are, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in drug money, just go on and on and on for no apparent reason. So there are winners from 9/11 there. And then, of course, there are the insider traders who may have been in a position to make plenty of money on both of these crises. Again, Mr. Larry Fink, who was handed the keys to the Treasury after the Corona crisis destroyed the American economy, had apparently been insider trading before that and made a killing on the crisis before it happened, or as it happened. So if we do the follow the money approach, we see a lot of people who might have connections to what we would think of as an international deep state who are making out like proverbial bandits. In fact, most of them actually are bandits. And the detectives who know that when there's a big crime, follow the money, would be doing this if they were allowed to. Of course, our mainstream media are not taking that kind of approach because they're just not very good detectives. So let's look at the cui bono approach in terms of the geopolitics. And I think that's where Ron's presentation was kind of pointing us. Let's go back to geopolitics 101 here and think about 9/11 and the Corona crisis in terms of their geopolitical effects and contexts. Now, 9/11, we could have predicted it was necessary because of what the people in Israel thought would have to be done to make the region safe for their country's endless expansion and even continued existence. Remember, Israel was in very shaky shape in the late 90s. The dot-com bust had utterly destroyed its economy, and people were emigrating much faster than they were immigrating, partly due to the suicide bombings that were following from Israel's bad faith in carrying through on the peace negotiations and the Oslo Agreement. So as an alternative course there, well, actually, it was really probably the main planned course in Israel from the beginning. The Clean Break document of 1996 said that we need to have a completely radically new policy that focuses on, busting up the neighboring countries along with the plan that was sketched out by Oded Yinon decades earlier. And we need to transcend our enemies, not just defeat them. By transcending them, changing the entire landscape in a kind of a Sun Tzu move that would make it impossible for the pro-Palestinian forces to continue. And that's what 9/11 gave them. The Palestinian resistance was largely crushed in terms of its military capacities. Saddam Hussein, who'd been funding it, was removed. Muammar Gaddafi, who had been funding it, was removed. The Iranians, who'd been funding and supporting it, have been put on the defensive through immense hostile action since 2001, and the whole region has basically been busted up and wrecked on behalf of Israeli expansionism. So the logical necessity of 9/11 would have been visible to anybody who studied that Clean Break document and was studying the geopolitics of the region. And then there was the clash of civilizations, which told us that, in fact, the next big thing in foreign relations would be the civilizations going up against each other. Western civilization was going to have to take on the competitors, starting with those Muslims. And now it looks like maybe we're moving on to the Chinese. And that brings us to the logical necessity of the COVID crisis from a geopolitical standpoint. And two key documents to get a sense of this that you can look at that won't take you that much time to read would be material on the so-called Thucydides trap. Graham Allison has been associated with that. He's written a book about it and articles. The Thucydides trap is based on a Greek historian and work on the Peloponnesian Wars, is that those who are rising in the world, who pose a threat to the dominant power, that is the rising number two power, often will provoke a preemptive war on the part of the number one power. The number one power will attack the number two power before it rises and gets too strong. And we see this pattern over and over throughout history. Now we have a clear case of a rising number two power, China, which is rising very rapidly. It's been growing, averaging double-digit growth for 4 decades. They've lifted 800 million people out of poverty, and they've got a long list of assets that make China look like the likely global superpower of the future, or maybe the most powerful of a group of rough equals. But in any case, China is poised to supplant the United States and end the days of that new American century of American hegemony, which we've been enjoying, I suppose, since World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War in 1989. So the Thucydides trap tells us that 2/3 of the time, whenever there's a number two power rising to challenge a number one power, the result is war. And it's typically preemptive war by the number one power. Now let's supplement the literature on China's rise by looking at the John Mearsheimer. Let's stay back at the previous slide for just a second. John Mearsheimer wrote an article, Can China Rise Peacefully, published in 2014, that did a very good job, back, not forward. It did a really good job giving us the context of why the United States would almost certainly be dragged into one of these Thucydides trap style wars with China in the not too distant future. And of course, he hopes and prays that that's not going to happen, but he says that the logic dictates that it will happen. So the geopolitical logic here is very strong too. And this would support Ron Unz's hypothesis that what we're looking at could very well be a biological attack on China on behalf of that aspect of the US deep state that is most rabid in its desire for eternal American hegemony, for a new American century, as the authors of that PNAC document put it exactly 1 year before 9/11. And those people, of course, they also put in the same document that the biological weapons very likely would go from being some just kind of a random sort of terrorist threat to becoming quote unquote a useful tool. And maybe they thought it would be a useful tool. So let's move to the next slide now, and maybe we can make the slides fill up the screen again and without crashing the system. So let's think about whether we could have, I think we crashed the system. Let's think about whether we could have had some combination of the cui bono from the perspective of the big financial interests, especially the banking lobby that runs the international deep state, and the geopolitical perspective that tells us this would be kind of a US state operation against China. And frankly, I think we can reconcile these two motives. First, we must remember that, again, as John Perkins points out in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and as we can find in all sorts of other literature, mostly alternative literature, but even a careful reading of a lot of the mainstream literature will support this, that the US government, and indeed the Western governments, are largely owned and operated, or certainly heavily influenced at least, by a private banking cartel. And The strong version of this holds that world banking cartel is seeking to establish a one world dictatorship through a war whose principal weapon is debt, but which will use violence when the debt weapon is not getting results. Again, this is the theme of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This cartel puts governments in increasing debt and then forces them to turn over control of their assets, giving the banking cartel even more money and power, until one day they'll have so much money and power that the entire world will be on their payroll and under their command. I don't think you have to be a crazy Illuminati conspiracy theorist to figure out that this really is happening. And so that cartel, that banking cartel that's raking in the money, that's got this, $4.5 trillion worth of QE and counting. They've got a blank checkbook there. Mnuchin has $500 billion to dole out to his friends with essentially no oversight whatsoever. These are the people who basically own the US government that might be going to war against China. Why would they do that? Well, they, of course, want to increase their own wealth and power. And they don't like China's public banking system. That's one of the reasons that they might very well have the neocon part of their deep state launch a bio attack on China. The Chinese banking system is 80% public, state-owned, and the whole society is regulated in such a way that the private investors or banksters can't just walk in and buy up everything. And so when you read in the newspaper that, we hoped that the Chinese, as they got richer, would follow the liberal Western model and bring in free speech and free thought and stop slurping bat soup in their wet markets and be just like us, what that really means, the translation of what's being said is, we thought that if we could help the Chinese get rich, that they would knuckle under to us and allow our banking cartel to move in and buy them up, just like it's bought up almost every other country in the world except Iran. So this banking cartel would have every reason to be on board with a deep state bio attack on China. Would they be on board for a deep state bio attack on the entire world? Well, let's move to the next slide and think about why it might not be accidental blowback that has led this virus to wipe out the whole world. It could be deliberate. Why would they welcome this? Well, again, Mnuchin's made $500 billion for himself and his friends with no oversight. The QE is in the trillions. The governments all over the world are now having to borrow emergency money at compound interest from this banking cartel, putting them ever more into debt slavery forever. The US billionaires have increased their net worth by almost $500 billion, according to Forbes magazine. The job situation is 40 million Americans have lost their jobs. That's very convenient for restructuring the economy, which they were desperate to do anyway. They want to bring in automation and end those jobs anyway, and they're not going to return, and now they have an excuse. They couldn't just fire everybody, but if they unleash a virus, they just fired everybody, and nobody knows that they did it. And then finally, this restructuring is outsourcing what jobs are left to Mexico and Vietnam and other alternatives, but China is now being cut out. According to John Mersheimer, the number one strategic priority for the United States, meaning the banksters that own the United States, is to stop China's rapid economic growth, even if that requires crippling the global economy, even if it requires sacrificing global prosperity. And that very well could be what's going on here. China is being stuck in the sort of the mid-level income trap, where it's got too much money to be the source of the low-wage factories producing everything for the world, but not enough to become a leader in the advanced sectors. And that's where they want China to be stuck. So this is way too convenient. I think we have one more slide left. And so following this, the more global reset items that this COVID crisis ticks off, leading us to wonder whether it might not be deliberate, not just the attack on China, but maybe they wanted it to play out everywhere else too. The small businesses are gone. The big firms rule. That's good for the people that can control the big firms. Distressed assets are being bought up cheaply by the big players, just like in all previous crises. And there are many historians who argue that the Great Depression and other crises, in fact, all busts are engineered by the big players to buy up the small players at pennies on the dollar. And that's happening in spades right now. Another convenient aspect of this from their standpoint would be that the useless eaters, that is the poor, the minorities, the workers, and old and sick people, the demographic bulge that's really making it hard for the economy to work properly, they're being culled. The useless eaters are being culled. And we have 265 million people now globally facing food insecurity. And Bill Gates sort of chuckles about pandemic 2. If you think pandemic 1 is something, just wait till you see pandemic 2. Well, I can imagine pandemic 2, if it's that much worse than what we're seeing now, would be starving enough people around the world to get them their depopulation agenda. And I hope they're not that evil, but I have no evidence that they're not. Finally, we have Social Security likely being gutted by the CARES Act, Section 2302, which freezes payments into Social Security, which is going to cause a crisis for Social Security. They may be able to restructure things without, or at least radically scale back Social Security. All of this is massively centralizing wealth and power in the hands of the people that run the system, turning the planet into a global slave plantation. And finally, this was all predicted in the lockstep simulation 10 years ago, which is giving us this multi-layer control grid, which will prevent rebellion as they turn the world into a global slave plantation. So I think we have one more slide. Let's go there. So what is this multi-layer control grid? We're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, heightened techno surveillance with contact tracing, and then 5G will make surveillance even more efficient. Cameras everywhere, everything connected in real time, watching you. We're seeing the first ever experiment in global house arrest, the so-called universal lockdown. We're seeing the demonization of the viral conspiracy theories as a threat to public health. So there's an info quarantine. Now the UNS review is no longer findable through Google. It's been quarantined because those terrible truths could contaminate people and they could spread. Massive censorship. The war on cash. Cash is now dirty, so everybody's going to have to get into traceable digital currency, and that will end economic privacy, except for the people that run the system. This end of economic privacy and the destruction of small business essentially puts everybody on the bankster's payroll. And economic independence is the basis of free thought. As I learned when I was basically chased out of the University of Wisconsin for talking about 9/11, the day after I went on Fox for the first time, $500,000 disappeared from the engineering school at the university and canceled private contributions. And there were other funding problems that came up because of me as well. So if you're on the payroll, ultimately the people that print the money call the shots. But then I learned that the independent cafes in Madison, Wisconsin all jumped on board the 9/11 Truth Movement and invited me into their cafes to have public teach-ins and events because they're all making their money by selling coffee to people. Well, the cafes are all closed down now. All the small businesses are closed. The only institutions left are all pretty much straight on the bankster payroll, another way to quash dissent so they can bring in this global slave plantation without rebellion. And then finally, and this is controversial for many of my viewers, but I'll say it anyway, there's a war on religion going on. 9/11 was a brainwashing operation to tell us that religious people are fanatical suicide terrorists. And this COVID crisis is telling us that religious people are superstitious idiots who are spreading disease. And what the controllers are doing is they're instrumentalizing fear of death for psychological control. That's the basis of the mass panic post 9/11 and the mass COVID panic. That's why people are running out for toilet paper and using masks as totems now. It's the same reason they were waving the flags post 9/11. And religion actually, in my view, the right kind of religion is the solution, because religion is the unveiling of the fact that our souls are eternal. We have absolutely no reason to fear death if we've acted well in this life, and therefore they can't control us. But that's why they're doing what they're doing, shutting down the churches, demonizing religion, and perhaps also demonizing research on psi, which also would provide evidence, science-based evidence, that the human consciousness or soul or whatever you want to call it is not merely an epiphenomenon of the material plane. So I better stop here before I go off into a wild and crazy lecture that makes me look like an even crazier conspiracy theorist than I actually am, which is saying something. And I think we're at the right time for the Q&A. So we have about 30 minutes of Q&A here. And then we'll go into part two, getting into some of the actual, debate about the bioweapon hypothesis, the people who are saying it's not a bioweapon, people who are saying it is, and so on and so forth. But let's take some questions here for me and Ron Unz. Unfortunately, Francis Boyle won't be able to answer questions since he gave us the video that was recorded a while ago. So we have all kinds of interesting chat here. And let me see if I can, okay, there's the Q&A. And what do I see in the Q&A here? We have the first question. And I don't know whether people want me to use their full names here or not. So just so I don't make a mistake, I'll leave out the full names unless I'm told that I should be using them. So SG is asking Ron Unz, the question is, at the heart of the argument, is it the implicit assumption that the virus is lab origin, U.S. government lab? This is a fundamental scientific question that cannot be wished away. Okay, so is that the heart of your argument, Ron? I don't think it is.
Not really. Again, it's a very simple issue. A mysterious virus appears suddenly in the city of Wuhan and begins spreading throughout that city and the rest of China. At first, there's no indication whether the virus is natural or unnatural, genetically engineered or anything like that. But it's just that the timing of the release of the virus, coming at the absolute worst possible time for China, where it had a very high likelihood of spreading throughout the entire country and devastating the economy, possibly for many years to come, is just extremely suspicious. Next, we see the virus suddenly appears in Iran, which is the other country most viewed with hostility by the United States at that point, targeting the Iranian elites, killing and infecting many of the top figures in Iran. Now, here's another way of looking at it. At the beginning of January, the US government publicly assassinated one of Iran's top military political figures. And based on, again, what happened, a few weeks after we assassinated a top Iranian leader, Iran's political elites became infected by this deadly, mysterious virus, which is an extraordinarily suspicious sort of coincidence. So when you have America most hostile at that point in time to China and Iran, and both of them being hit very hard by this mysterious new virus, it obviously raises some extremely deep suspicions. And then again, with the fact that the US government was aware of the virus, was publicly aware of the virus and its outbreak in China a month before there's any evidence that anybody in China was aware, furthers that point. Now, the truth is, again, it's not at all clear to me. I've deliberately stayed away from many of the scientific issues because there's so much argument and debate on both sides going back and forth. You can find experts taking every different position in journal articles or preprints. The truth is, you could either have the virus being entirely natural, being genetically engineered, or being basically enhanced through standard laboratory techniques without biological engineering. And any of those scenarios are perfectly plausible, but I think there's a tremendous amount of circumstantial evidence that the virus was released in both China and Iran for military reasons, to basically cripple the Chinese economy and to hit political elites in Iran. And I mean, it's simply that, the odds of it happening under those circumstances through entirely fortuitous events seem very low. And it doesn't explain why the Defense Intelligence Agency had publicly released a report on the cataclysmic outbreak of this virus in China long before anybody in China was aware of it. It's simply factually based. So again, the scientific issue, I think, is very much of a secondary one. It seems to me a fairly reasonable likelihood that it was produced through laboratory techniques, but it certainly isn't, relevant necessarily to the point.
Okay, good answer. And I agree. You have to be a crazy coincidence theorist to look at what happened in Wuhan and especially what happened in Iran and think that that's purely random. So, next question: did anyone look at the counteractions against COVID-19 of the state of Israel, and is there anything suspicious about them? Well, that's a natural question, especially given what happened on 9/11 and afterwards. Um, my very brief answer would be very early on in February, there were announcements that Israel was going to have a vaccine out in a week or something like that, which was just ridiculous. Obviously, there couldn't be unless they had somehow made one way ahead of time, but that didn't pan out. So that's really, I don't have a whole lot more on that. So far, my research on this really has not been pointing a finger at Israel in the way that the 9/11 research does. What do you think, Ron?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, there's really no evidence. Again, the fact that some Israeli scientist was talking about they're having a vaccine ready very quickly because they were working that area is certainly suspicious. But it also could just be the sort of bragging that, for example, all these medical technology companies have been doing, to try to get sort of ahead of that issue. One interesting point on the other side is that, for example, when ABC News disclosed the fact that the Defense Intelligence Agency had been releasing that report on the tremendous outbreak in Wuhan long before anybody in China was aware of it. It turns out it was afterwards confirmed by Israeli media. In other words, Israeli intelligence sources said, yes, we received exactly that report by the US government that they were distributing. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence at all that Israel was involved in this biological attack, though, to the extent that, for example, individuals associated with, the neocon perspective in America's national security apparatus probably were, heavily involved in it. It could be certain people in Israel might have been made aware of it, but there seems to be no evidence of that.
Mhm. And I would just add, though, that there is a history of Israel being involved in many of the most reckless and insane actions of the U.S. national security state, from the Kennedy assassination to building H bombs for South Africa, for building race-specific biological weapons for South Africa, for the most extreme Central and South American mass-killing dictators, and on and on and on. There is that history where the U.S. national security state seems we don't want something really dirty done. It seems like the Israelis come in and help it, or sometimes it's the Israelis maybe leading the way. So I can see why people are suspicious. But I agree, Ron, that we don't really have a whole lot to go on here other than the attack in Iran. But the U.S. has been dragged into going after Iran by the Israelis. So I don't know if that's the place where we would think that it would be Israel doing it any more than the U.S. So next question, we have, let's see, a link for 3 strains of COVID-19 and mutations B and C. I think that really, ask us that one again after the second series of presentations, because the more scientific investigation here will be in the second part of this webinar. Okay, we have Barbara Honegger, who's, I know she's willing to use her name. And Barbara is a former senior national security expert journalist at the Monterey Defense Facility, whatever, I'm forgetting the name of that university. Anyway, she is, okay, she's going to give us a question live in a few minutes, and she is ready to ask. So Alan, are you able to bring Barbara up now? Maybe you can tell me in the chat whether you can do that. Let's see, I'm not seeing a chat from Barbara. Or I'm from Alan telling me about whether he can bring Barbara up live right now or not. Okay, yeah, Barbara, you need to have your hand up. So there's a little thing you click on. Anybody who wants to ask a live question with your voice and or your picture on camera, you would have to click the hands up thing, put your hand up, and then Alan can bring you on. I know it's a little complicated. So we have Greg. Greg probably doesn't mind using his name. I'll just use his first name, though, just in case. And Greg says, in February 2019, the Trump administration removed Obama's moratorium on gain-of-function research for SARS, MERS, and avian flu. Does this not imply that the U.S. is responsible for the novel coronavirus outbreak? What reason would the Chinese have for a bioweapon, and what was behind the removal of this moratorium? Okay. The end of the moratorium in February 2019 on gain-of-function research for these this class of viruses. That's very suspicious. What do you think, Ron?
Yeah, it seems suspicious. I mean, the truth is, you know, situations like that where, for example, you have different, I mean, most countries around the world, as far as we can tell, have probably, there's a good chance have been involved in various types of biological warfare research. So, you know, it's not really clear whether America had really discontinued its biological warfare. For example, there are a lot of claims going around that we have a lot of laboratories in other countries around the world that we use for our biological purpose. I think there's one in Georgia, there's one possibly in Armenia. So it's not clear whether that decision in February 2019 you're talking about really had any direct connection to the, you know, to the possible release of this particular biological agent. But it certainly does support the sense that elements of the Trump administration were certainly thinking and talking about the use of biological warfare in a way that possibly previous administrations have been more reluctant.
Okay, very good answer. Well, now let's move on to the people who have their hands up who want to go on camera. And the first person on the list is somebody who I'm sure doesn't mind having their name used. It's my friend Peter Myers. So let's bring on Peter here, and I think Ellen is the one doing that. Let's see if I can see. Yeah, here comes Peter to ask his question. Hello, Peter. Maybe Ellen, you need to bring him up somehow or unmute him. I see the little box that says Peter Myers, but I don't see Peter. Well, maybe we'll figure out how to bring him up.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you are. Hello, Peter. Welcome.
Well, your case is deductive. It's not like 9/11 where there was a lot of evidence lying around for a conspiracy. I'd like to present some counter evidence and see what your panelists say to that. So I'm going to list the counter evidence sequentially by date. September 18th, Wuhan held a drill simulating a coronavirus infection. October the 3rd, Chinese virologists were arrested in Winnipeg. October the 21st, Chinese Congress heard a report or received a report warning of the risk of leaks from biolabs. January the 2nd, the director of Wuhan Institute of Virology issued a notice forbidding anyone to release information on COVID. January the 28th, Charles Lieber and 2 Chinese students were arrested. The students were trying to smuggle biological material to China. February the 6th, there was a report from Chinese scientists from Wuhan and Guangzhou saying COVID likely leaked from Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is 12 kilometers from the wet market, or Wuhan CDC, which is only 280 meters from the market, 280 meters. That report was uploaded to ResearchGate, but later removed. And February the 13th, there was an order from Beijing saying, quote, put an end to the theft, leakage, and loss of pathogenic bacteria.
Okay, so that pattern of evidence, to what extent does that implicate the Chinese? To what extent could some of it be part of a setup? Well, let's ask Ron. So Ron, what do you make of this?
Well, that's really the key point. In other words, for example, to the extent that we have the hypothesis that the US would have launched a biological warfare attack against China in the way I discussed, it obviously would have prepared an enormous number of prepackaged cover stories to basically divert attention from what really would have happened. And a couple of the examples that you give, I've actually looked into it, and the facts are really quite different than what you suggest. But the point is basically, you know, if you're when you're talking about an intelligence agency, obviously with an effort of this magnitude, it's possible to produce a tremendous amount of chaff to divert attention from basic, simple facts. And the truth is, when we're talking about basically 2 countries in the world being hit, China and Iran, which happened to be the 2 countries that America was most hostile to at that point, the points you're talking don't really explain why the Iranian elites were hit by the virus almost immediately after the outbreak in Wuhan. And, you know, it's the sort of thing when you're talking about some of those pieces of evidence. Take, for example, the Charles Lieber case. We're talking about a very high-ranking American scientist, viewed as really likely Nobel Prize winner, chairman of the chemistry department at Harvard, being suddenly arrested by, I believe it was the FBI, in an early morning raid and dragged away in handcuffs and threatened with up to 10 or 20 years of imprisonment for supposedly misreporting some minor issue in a government form that he filled out. And it really, at the time it occurred, the media never drew a connection between that and the outbreak taking place in China at exactly the same point in time. But it seems the obvious connection was we're talking about basically one of America's highest ranking scientists who'd worked closely for many years with China, who had a tremendous amount of credibility in the field, being suddenly threatened with a decade or 2 decades of imprisonment over the sort of most minor paperwork offenses you can imagine. And it seems to me the reason something like that probably would have happened most likely is simply to intimidate him and most other scientists from speaking their mind of what was probably happening with regard to the outbreak of the disease in China. And, you know, the truth is, what scenario would there be? Would there be any, for example, claim that he was involved in producing biological weapons for China? The issue was never raised. Nobody ever made that claim. It was simply that he allegedly failed to report a certain amount of income that he'd received from Chinese grants on some of his government grant applications to the United States. And the connection seems very, very suspicious from the point of view of the US government intimidating any scientists who might voice a contrary opinion to the sort that the media was promoting about the outbreak of that disease in China. And remember, it happened basically in late January, long before any of the viruses had apparently leaked to the West or any of the Western countries, that he was suddenly arrested. And the media never drew any connection between that and what was going on in China at the same time, though it seemed very obvious to me and to any outside observer.
Okay. Well, we have Barbara Honegger patiently waiting with her hand up. So let's see if we can bring up Barbara. And I think she wanted to be just on audio, but not video. So Barbara, you might have to turn off your camera. I don't know if Alan can do that for you, but we'll figure it out. But if worst comes to worst, I suppose we could just take your question with audio. So Alan's working on bringing up Barbara Honegger, who is well known in the 9/11 Truth Movement as both an activist and a researcher. And she has worked as an advisor to the Reagan administration, wrote the book October Surprise, one of the 2 books about the apparent coup d'etat when Reagan and Bush overthrew Jimmy Carter by conspiring to keep the US hostages locked up in Iran until Reagan and Bush were inaugurated. And of course, they were released something like about 30 seconds after Reagan took the oath of office. None of those things you have to be a crazy coincidence theorist not to wonder about. So do we have Barbara up yet, Alan? Maybe Alan can send me some kind of chat about that. Otherwise, we could move on to a different typed question. Let's see. Working on bringing Barbara up. Okay, we're working on Barbara.
I'm here, Kevin.
There she is. All right. Welcome, Barbara.
Yeah, I had to go through a whole bunch of steps because he had to make me into a regular panelist for some reason.
Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you. I just wanted to say that I completely agree with the evidence that I think is in front of us with you and Ron Unz. I'd like to put a few facts on the table. The first is when I was the senior military affairs journalist, which I was for about 16 years at the Naval Postgraduate School here in Monterey, California. All of the VIPs from the Navy and the US military, State Department, et cetera, would come here to the Naval Postgraduate School. And in 1996, the head of naval intelligence came. And being the senior military affairs journalist, I was assigned to interview him. At the end of the interview, I asked him, sir, who do you see as the major enemy of the United States near term and say 15, 20 years from now, which would put us about now? And he said, well, that's an easy one. The answer is China, with the association with Iran. And he also pointed out that there was no question that China was the rising world power and major rival to the United States that was going to have to be contained. That if we ever went to war because of their extremely large, relatively large population, the only way that we could win would be a biowar. And putting these facts together with the fact that the Event 201, which, as I understand it, the very next day after the end of Event 201, which was back in, I think, mid-October of last year, 2019, the very next day was when the Wuhan military games began, with 300 of our military personnel, many of whom couldn't really compete. So that's not probably why they were there. At the Event 201, if you just watch it, you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. It was recorded and it's on YouTube. You will see that the major military participant was a very high-ranking Navy admiral. So I just put all of these facts together, and I'd like to point out one other thing that leads to a question, and that is, I can't remember right now. I could try to find it if someone was interested, but I recently read a claim or a statement that there were two factions in China, and it's pretty obvious. That there is of course, the official government faction, and then there is the pro-American faction. And I think that we should seriously consider the possibility that however the bioweapon was created in the Wuhan lab, that it was intentionally released by someone who was working with the so-called pro-American faction or pro-Western faction. And I point out that at the time that all of this happened, there were these huge demonstrations in Hong Kong. Finally, I read recently, and a huge, forgive the pun, red flag went up. And that was, I read that, and I believe it's a fact, that the underlying bat virus came from a cave about 1,000 miles south of Wuhan, and that Dr. Shi was the head of the research that went down and got those bats that were used for the research. And I recently read, and this is where the red flag went up, that Anna Chenault's flying tigers somehow were related to the area around that very cave. Now that I need to follow that up, but this whole nexus of facts leads me to agree that the Chinese did not do this to themselves. No, they did not. And all of the who did it or cui bono points to a Western attack on China, a preemptive attack.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. That's very interesting. Ron, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it simply makes a lot of sense. In other words, if China and Iran are viewed as are viewed with the greatest hostility by America, and suddenly there's a mysterious biological warfare outbreak in both China and Iran, two countries around the world, first especially targeting the Iranian leadership, it seems an extremely suspicious amount of circumstantial evidence pointing in a particular direction.
Okay, well, I think we're leaning towards accepting that, hopefully, here. So there are a number of other people with many good questions. Some of these questions maybe could be asked at the end of the next section, because we're getting towards the time when that should start. We have someone asking about Dr. Judy Mikovits. That's actually my friend Mike asking that. We have a question about COVID-19 already in the US in mid-2019, and that might also be something we could address in the second section, unless, Ron, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, I'm extremely doubtful about some of those claims that the virus was circulating in the United States during 2019, because the key aspect of the virus is that it's extremely contagious. and grows in numbers exponentially under normal circumstances. In other words, basically, if you have a handful of people infected in a community, a month or two later, you'll have a gigantic outbreak. And that certainly would have been true in the United States. So if the virus had been present here in any time, say mid 2019, there would have been a gigantic outbreak 6 months sooner than actually occurred, and we would have known about it. In fact, nobody would have paid any attention to the outbreak in China because a much larger outbreak would have already occurred in the United States.
Okay, and then one more question. I think Ron, you might have heard about this as I did. That the Zero Hedge story about mobile phone activity from Wuhan lab suggests possible shutdown in October due to hazardous event, which goes along with what Peter Myers was talking about. That Zero Hedge story, I believe that's been pretty thoroughly debunked because there was another reason for that mobile phone shutdown. Do you recall that one?
I haven't looked at it, to be honest. Again, I'm very suspicious about these sorts of technical bits of information that an intelligence agency can easily present or even fabricate. So I haven't even looked at it, but from what you're saying, it's anyway already been debunked.
Yeah, I think it has. But of course, more research is always necessary. And Peter wonders about Italy. The other, like we mentioned, the first two big outbreaks were China and Iran. What a coincidence, the two biggest enemies. And then Italy. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Why Italy? What do they have against Italians? They don't like pizza? No, but seriously.
The whole thing is we have to separate the targeted, the groups the countries that were targeted, which would have been China and Iran, who first received the outbreaks, as opposed to the virus then leaking back into the West. In other words, I'm very, very skeptical that there was an intent to destroy the American economy and kill 100,000 Americans by the virus coming here. When the SARS or MERS epidemics had occurred, they never reached the United States. So, somebody, for example, launched these biological warfare attacks against China would have probably just vaguely assumed that, well, SARS didn't come back here, so this virus wouldn't come back here either. Now, in the case of Italy, Italy has the largest Chinese population of anywhere in Europe. And I think it's 250,000 Chinese work in the garment industry in Italy. So it's very easy to imagine a certain number of Chinese visitors due to the holidays coming back to Italy and the virus spreading at that point. And that seems to be what happened. In other words, whether the virus indirectly came from Chinese who were in Germany down to Italy or in Italy itself, I mean, you'd expect basically the country in Europe that has the largest Chinese population to be hit by this virus, just as some of the East Asian countries were. So, in a sense, Italy, France, and the United States were unexpected blowback as the virus leaked into these societies and ended up growing exponentially in number.
Okay, and I think that's a good, strong hypothesis. And I did my best to argue for reasons why maybe somebody would have thought that blowback would be okay. So those are our two hypotheses here on the table. And I think you did a great job of presenting yours, Ron. So I think we're at a point now where we could move on to the next series of presentations about the more technical debate around whether this is a bioweapon or not. It is kind of confusing. It's not as easy to sort through as some of the scientific debates around 9/11. Building 7 you don't have to be an engineer or an architect to look at Building 7 and use your basic physics to understand there's a huge problem with the official story there. And there's some other issues on 9/11 like that as well. But here, if you're not well-versed in microbiology and biological warfare and things like that, it's really hard to make sense of the conflicting arguments that are being put out. And most recently, that's Australian study saying that this couldn't have possibly evolved naturally. There are many people saying that, and there are others saying the opposite. So let's move into part 2, where we look at some of the details of that debate. And first, the most prominent attempt to argue that this couldn't be a artificial creation was published in Nature Medicine, and then it was picked up by other places and echoed in various ways. And that argument is I'm still a little unclear about how it works. But we do have a biological warfare expert, actually a couple of them here. Barry Kissin, he's not a scientist, but he's a lawyer. He did a lot of work around the anthrax affair of 2001. and he's also a longtime anti-biowar activist. Happens to live right next door to Fort Detrick, and so Barry's going to tell us what is that argument that this couldn't be artificial. This looks like a naturally occurring virus. So take it away, Barry Kissin.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and everybody else for participating. I don't propose to get too deeply into the technical aspects of this. I agree with Ron that it's very difficult to decide on a technical basis as to what this is. And yes, there are a host of reputable scientists who are saying, no, this naturally occurred. And there are a host of reputable scientists who are saying it looks otherwise. My reading is that the weight of scientific opinion right now is that this is a naturally occurring germ. And I'm very sympathetic with that. I'm very sympathetic with that. I mean, you know, I could read a paragraph from the Nature Medicine article that you want to focus on, and it's got all this vocabulary very few people are familiar with. And I don't think in this discussion, you know, we're going to make any headway on deciding which technical argument is superior. I just don't. And I don't think conflict of interest analysis gets us anywhere. There are plenty of very reputable scientists who view this as a naturally occurring germ. I don't see where that's debatable. And I think it's the weight of opinion. I'll just turn to what I'm almost certain preceded the Nature Medicine article. That's the article that was published in Lancet on February 18, signed by 27 of the world's, Lancet characterizes them as 27 of the world's leading scientists in public health. Perhaps Merrill's in the position to say some of them have conflict of interest. I don't think conflict of interest ordinarily proves anything. It says this is a potential reason why they might be saying what they're saying, but all it is a potential reason. And I don't think everybody operates in keeping with their conflict of interest. I don't think that's what people do. And I'm not inclined to think that all 27 of these scientists in public health are doing that. I'm bringing this up because I basically agree with the germ of their statement. I mean, after they say, we've looked at the genetic analysis, the genetic sequencing, and we've considered other ways of enhancing this germ, and we've looked at possible avenues of natural evolution. We believe the weight of the evidence is that this is a product of natural evolution. But then they go on to say as follows: the rapid, open, and transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened by rumors and misinformation around its origins. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Scientists from multiple countries have published and analyzed genomes of the causative agent, and they overwhelmingly conclude that this coronavirus originated in wildlife. Conspiracy theories do nothing but create fear, rumors, and prejudice that jeopardize our global collaboration in the fight against this virus. I am very concerned about humanity's capability of effecting global collaboration. At the same time, as I am bound and determined that global collaboration is not only necessary in the context of COVID-19, but is necessary more generally to human survival. Now, is it impossible? Well, it may be impossible. There's a lot of reasons to think it is impossible. We've heard some reasons already from Kevin and Ron to think that it's impossible. But I think we've got to hold out for that possibility. And in this case, when the evidence is clearly insufficient, I think clearly insufficient, to prove anything by way of conspiracy. I mean, please notice, Thomas Wilcott makes some reference to this in his paper. Most of what Kevin and Ron say is couched in might have been, may have been, could have been. I mean, it really is. Very rarely in their presentations do you hear the word clearly at all? Sometimes Kevin drifts into that. The person, of course, that does a lot of clearlies is Francis Boyle. That's the first presentation in this. And I don't think anybody agrees with Francis, which is kind of curious. I mean, no, I mean, look, I've known Francis for a long time. I must say that his career of service is tremendously essential and tremendously exemplary. And I've been on his private listserv for a long time, so is Merrill. Merrill may have withdrawn recently, and that was the point at which Francis goes after Richard E. Bright. Not a very good target, in my view. Richard E. Bright is, I think, one of our most eminent molecular biologists and very abreast of bioengineering and genetic sequencing. He's been very, very clear in his opinion that he's looked at the genetic sequence, and no, he actually goes so far as to say, I rule out. Richard E. Bright has said, I rule out genetic engineering. I rule it out. He's gone that far. Francis comes along and says, well, he's got a conflict of interest. Not a good target. I think it upset Merrill, and it upset me too. I just thought it was overboard. And of course, I watched what happened with Francis. Francis comes up with this theory that this is a Chinese bioweapon that came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And he'll tell you that he comes up with this on January 24, very early in the game. And then I'm afraid, I know Francis is not here to defend himself, that Francis falls prey to what all of us are prone to, which is, this is the position I'm taking, and I'm going to hold on to it regardless. It's an unfortunate tendency on all of our parts not to be open to conflicting evidence, and there's plenty of conflicting evidence to dispute Professor Boyle's premises. One of them was pointed out his insistence that COVID-19 must be a bioweapon because it's so lethal. Well, no, Francis, it's not that lethal. I think everybody agrees it's not anywhere near 15%. He rattled off 17% and 18% during that film segment. But yeah, what Francis did on January 24 is he said, okay, I'm the first one to realize that WIV has China's only BSL-4, and this very much put him on the path of this has got to be a bioweapon, and a Chinese bioweapon, and it came out of WIV. Plenty of conflicting evidence. There is that other lab facility. I'll just mention it. I think Ron did as well. It's a Chinese CDC facility that is much closer to the market, and in fact, right next to the hospital where the first cases of COVID-19 are recognized. It's right next to it. It only has a BSL-2, but it also, according to the article that both Francis and I relied on, was harboring, I think they gave the exact number in this article, it's a Chinese article, 650, I think it was 650 bats diseased with coronavirus. And I don't want to do too much more on technical, but the consensus that Kevin senses we might have so far is that the facts that China is the first large-scale victim and Iran is the next is extremely incriminating. Well, I'm not so sure. Yes, it's very troubling that COVID-19 infected the highest echelons of Iranian society. I don't have exact on that. Ron's made some reference to it. But yes, it clearly impacted members of parliament, and that's an important fact. We also know that China and Iran have been developing cooperation. I think very appropriate cooperation under the geopolitical circumstances. Iran is already partaking of the emerging Silk Road, and there's a lot going on between China and Iran that doesn't meet the eye. That's got to be clear. And that's a much less, shall we say, incriminating fact than than what Kevin and Ron are relying on. And then right towards the end of our discussion, Ron cites the fact that there's 250,000 people in Italy, and that's why Italy falls next. I mean, another thing that one saw to try to explain Italy was that Italy was the one European country that seemed to be more open to cooperating with China than the others, so that's another reason to attack them. But not only do all of us disagree with Francis, but none of us, we'll hear from Meryl and Tom, but certainly Ron and Kevin don't agree on the conspiracy. I mean, there's a pretty substantial difference between their approaches. Ron says that the spreading pandemic that is hurting the United States more than it hurt China was inadvertent and unforeseen. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, you can't on one hand say we're engineering something or we're using cell cultures to advance contagiousness and then suggest that it catches us by surprise that it's invading the West. I don't see how you can do that. Meryl at one point writes that she doesn't think this is a bioweapon precisely because you don't unleash a bioweapon when you have no way of controlling it against yourself. That's almost her exact words. I think that's right. Kevin, on the other hand, Kevin's thesis, certainly a substantial one of his, is that this is all deliberate, that this isn't just to attack China and Iran. This is to attack everybody for the sake of, well, among others, the banking cartel. Well, okay, I guess, perhaps, but perhaps not. And again, there are so many pieces of all of these different conspiracy theories missing that in the meantime, we're doing what 27 experts in public health caution against, which is we are undermining the possibility of global collaboration, which is our only salvation, not only with respect to COVID-19, but with respect to the future of the human race. I'm happy to leave it there for now. And I look forward to participating in the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Barry. And we'll probably be able to go back and forth on some of those items in the Q&A. But first, let's go to Dr. Meryl Nass. She's a world-class bioweapons expert who's published some amazing work exposing the use of biological weapons. She has recently published an article, Why Are Some of the US Top Scientists Making a Specious Argument About the Natural Origin of SARS-CoV-2? And then she has published just a couple of days ago a new article, HCQ, or hydroxychloroquine, Corrupt Coordinated Assault Managed by WHO on an Inexpensive and Effective Treatment. So in both cases, I guess she sees that the fix is in. Let's hear about it. Welcome, Meryl Nass.
Thanks. So I've been adjusting what I wanted to present as we've gone on. I thought at first I would talk about the history of biological warfare, but it seems like maybe the audience is very familiar with that. I'll just say that, as everybody knows, Japan initiated a very extensive biological warfare program around 1930. And the United States is acknowledged to have done so starting in 1942. And that many other countries did around the same time. And after the war was over, the United States had no intentions of stopping its program. But in 1969, November, for possibly many reasons, Nixon said unilaterally the United States was going to eschew its biological agent program. We were going to get rid of it, and we were going to then ask the rest of the world to do the same thing and initiate a treaty. People pointed out he hadn't stopped toxins. Toxins may have an interesting use, particularly good for assassination. And so he did, a couple months later, add toxins as well. And then we did initiate the Biological Weapons Convention, which went around. Most nations signed it. Israel never has. And it went into force in 1975. So some people left Fort Detrick was made smaller. Several people left Fort Detrick and came to the University of Massachusetts. However, it was reported in the Washington Post and in the San Francisco Chronicle, same article, that African swine fever had been sent to Cuba via Panama by the CIA and had been used in 1971. And Cuba had to kill about 500,000 pigs at that point. So 1971, remember, Nixon made his proclamation in 69 and 70. That ban did not go into force until 1975. 1978, well, even before 78, in 1978, Rhodesia had its big anthrax epizootic begin. Anthrax started popping up all over the country in different places over the next couple of years. And then subsequent to that, it was in the soil. So they've always had more than their share of anthrax subsequently. There was an anthrax outbreak in Sverdlovsk, which has been attributed to basically an open valve that allowed in a factory that was supposedly manufacturing anthrax. As you know, anthrax can only be used as a biological weapon. There's no other reason to manufacture it. So presumably the Russians also were, when I say also, I guess the Rhodesians had not signed the treaty either. They were not an independent country. And subsequent to all that, there have been charges by Cubans, by industries, that an industry or a plantation has been attacked with usually a plant or an animal biological weapon. And generally, all of these allegations remain unresolved. So I was the first person to actually resolve, I made the allegation and resolved it about the anthrax epidemic in Rhodesia, because anthrax is relatively easy to study, or I thought it was. It took me 3 years, but I was able to write a strong argument about why it could be nothing but a biological weapons attack. So since then, the United States and most other countries are supposed to not have a biological warfare program, so officially we don't. But we're allowed to have a biodefense program, and presumably, I think most people listening can agree, once you can do something with science, the military keeps a close eye on all the sciences, and people who work for the military are likely to find ways to put those discoveries or whatever it is, new organisms, new ways of making organisms to work. And so the way the Biological Weapons Convention works is that it's entirely based on intent. So if you intended to make a biological weapon, then you're guilty. But if you intended to produce this anthrax so that you could study ways to protect against it, you're not guilty, right? So nobody's been charged, nobody's been investigated. The treaty has gone nowhere. Now, Francis Boyle wrote legislation that implemented the treaty in the US. That implementing legislation within our nation has been used against a few, lone wolves, crazy people who were, cooking up biological weapons in their garage. But the international treaty has basically not been used. And every 6 years, there was supposed to be a convention to develop ways of strengthening the treaty, making it more meaningful. And that has gone nowhere. And in most cases, the United States has been responsible for that going nowhere. I haven't paid attention recently, but back 10, 20 years ago when I was paying attention, it was generally the United States that would throw a spanner in the works when other countries tried to bring in ways to make this treaty actually have some meaning. So let me move on with that background. In February, a group of interesting people wrote a letter to the Lancet, and it's a short letter. This is it. And it says, look, we want to stand with the medical professionals and public health people of China, and scientists from multiple, quote, scientists from multiple countries have published and analyzed genomes of the causative agent, and they overwhelmingly conclude that this coronavirus originated in wildlife, as have so many other emerging pathogens. Now that sounds like they're trying to give cover to prior SARS and MERS and maybe West African Ebola, because MERS aside, no immediate progenitor has been found for the original SARS or for this SARS, nor for the West African Ebola, although one of the groups of people who wrote the Nature Medicine article, or at least signed their name to it, last year claimed that they had found a likely progenitor to the West African Ebola. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are three viruses, SARS-1, SARS-2, and 2014 Ebola in West Africa, which went more than 1,000 miles from any prior locations where it had occurred. And Ebola was not identified previously until 1975 or thereabouts in the world. So this group of people and is trying to possibly can be read as providing cover for that epidemic. They wrote, conspiracy theories do nothing but create fear, rumors, and prejudice that jeopardize our global collaboration in the fight against this virus. I'm sorry, I don't know why I can't make that stop.
If your phone keeps ringing after you unplug it, you know somebody's after you.
After I turn it off. All right. God, well, I'm sorry.
Just when you're talking about conspiracy theories, an unplugged phone just won't stop ringing.
All right, it's a patient. Okay. So conspiracy theories do nothing but create fear, rumors, and prejudice that jeopardize our global collaboration in the fight against this virus. We support the call from the Director General of the WHO, to promote scientific evidence and unity over misinformation and conjecture. Okay, so who signed this? I'm just going to go through a few of them. The first one is Charlie Kalischer, who is someone who the Cubans identified to me when I was down in Cuba in 1993, helping to investigate their neuropathy epidemic, as the person who had studied their mosquitoes and led to the unleashing of dengue in Cuba. So I won't go any further. Rita Colwell was former head of the National Science Foundation. Peter Daszak is the founder of the Eco Health Alliance, this shady organization that gets a lot of defense money, NIAID money, USAID money, NSF money, and is a pass-through for some reason to many other organizations, particularly the Wuhan Lab for coronavirus research and catching bats. And this organization seems to be basically an organization designed to perform surveillance on emerging pathogens around the world. Give all these countries, give them a little money and let EcoHealth Alliance see what they're doing. The claim is that this will help prevent pathogens from emerging and will help us find ways to deal with them, but none of this money seems to have been spent on making any attempt to produce a drug or a vaccine. Jeremy Farrar, head of the Wellcome Trust. So James Hughes, a former number 2 or number 3 at CDC. And then a few other people who do research in a bunch of people who do research in this area. So that was the article in February. This is the article from March, Nature Medicine. This article basically says, you know, it supports the first letter from Lancet. It's signed by 5 people who, again, are involved in the same types of research that EcoHealth Alliance supports, the same coronaviral biological defense type research, a lot of international collaborations with the Chinese and with others. So two of the 5 authors of this article have positions in China, even though they are English speakers, one from the UK, one from the US. So this paper says a couple of things. It points out the 2 most interesting areas of the spike protein that people have so far identified. The spike protein is 13% of the genome, so there's a lot more that probably can be investigated and will. But those 2 things enhance the infectivity and enhance the cell types and make this virus much more amenable to humans. And so they are perfectly honest about that. They identify those things, but then they say, they make a number of childlike, ingenuous arguments to claim that these things could only have happened in natural circumstances rather than in the lab. And the arguments simply don't hold water. This is a paper. Unfortunately, you have to know the vocabulary of biology in order to understand it. But the claims are basically unsupported by the evidence that they provide. For example, they acknowledge that the ACE2 receptor is highly specialized for humans, but that it hasn't been described in the literature. So therefore, it's not, it doesn't come from a scientific lab because things about it haven't already been described. And basically they say we just have to go collect more bats, and then we'll find a natural progenitor most likely. So that's what they say. And this, there's nothing, I didn't do anything special pointing out that the paper was garbage, because anybody who can read the language could see that the paper was garbage. I used the example of old-fashioned biological warfare techniques, or actually old-fashioned techniques that anybody would use in a biological lab, to point out that those techniques could have been used to create this virus without using the specific types of genetic engineering that this paper claims would have been used to create it. So it seemed like a specious argument. If we were going to create this virus, we would have done it this way, but it wasn't created this way, therefore it wasn't created in the lab. That's the gist of the argument. It so happened that I knew who some of the people were who wrote it. I knew they were in this gray area of biodefense, biowarfare, military research. And I knew also, actually it came up later, that some of them had also disputed the origin of HIV with my friend Ed Hooper, who wrote the book, The River. So I thought that was interesting. And one of them had had a peculiar interaction with Ed, and a peculiar interaction with me as well. That was Bob Gary, with me 20 years ago over the anthrax vaccine, and with Ed about, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago. So these I thought were people who are used by the intelligence, or these sort of these are the scientists that get involved with things like Ebola outbreaks. And they seem to be the ones who create the cover stories and or help to create some of the cover stories. So that's all I said. All right. Final thing I want to say is, so I wrote a blog post a couple of days ago that tries to break down some of the information on hydroxychloroquine. Okay, so we're shifting gears. Hydroxychloroquine is a drug that's generic, easy to manufacture, was over the counter in some countries. Hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine are almost the same. I've taken chloroquine and I've prescribed for between 100 and 200 people hydroxychloroquine because it is the #1 drug for lupus. It is a secondary drug for Lyme disease. It's used in rheumatoid arthritis as well. So I had a lot of familiarity with this drug. I knew it was a pretty safe drug, as drugs go. And when Trump first said, this might be a game changer in COVID-19, I was pretty excited because I knew that it was a safe drug and easy to take and inexpensive. So you can buy a full course for about $1 in some countries. What happened subsequently? So as you know, there's been a lot of publicity about how dangerous this drug is and how it kills people. Turns out that if you are extremely ill from COVID, one of the organs that may be infected is the heart muscle. And if you do have myocarditis as a result of COVID, that increases your risk of arrhythmia. And it's certainly possible that in the setting of myocarditis, these drugs may increase your risk of arrhythmia. But people who are that sick are in the United States anyway, are all going to be on cardiac monitors. So if they have an arrhythmia, the alarm is going to go off and they can be treated immediately. And if they have QT interval prolongation, that will be seen almost certainly before they have the arrhythmia, because most of these people are going to be getting routine EKGs. So, so I did not believe the hype about how dangerous these drugs were. What happened 9 days ago is that the Lancet published a paper by 4 doctors, 3 have Indian names, claiming that they had a massive database that had over 60,000 COVID patients from 6 continents and 671 hospitals, and 11,000 or 15,000 of those patients had been given a chloroquine drug. And when they searched the database, they found that this group had a very much higher mortality, at least 50% higher mortality than the non-chloroquine patients. And so this was published in the Lancet, which is the #1 most read medical journal in the world, 9 days ago. And over last weekend, the WHO steering committee or executive committee, some group of 10 people in the WHO, the WHO is conducting a 35 country at the present moment clinical trial of 4 different treatments for COVID. And initially they didn't even have chloroquine drugs as one of the treatments, but subsequently they did. They added it. And so this steering group met last weekend and said, we must stop using chloroquine, it's too dangerous. And then, so they halted the chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine arm of the trial, and that's 35 countries, many hospitals. We're all told you can't use this in the trial anymore. But it turns out they did more than that, that Indonesia acknowledged in a Reuters interview, they had a couple of sources, that their Ministry of Health had been directed by WHO to stop using hydroxychloroquine at all in patients. And then there was media saying that India was going to continue to use hydroxy. Despite that, India was going to continue to use it. They're using it prophylactically. So they're using it in the all first responders and medical personnel in India have been told, we'd like you to use hydroxychloroquine prophylactically. You build up a blood level and then you don't even have to take it every day. You just take it every so often. And in Indonesia, they're using it very early in the course of COVID, and they say they're having very good results. So they said, well, you know, we'll pause. Indonesia said we'll pause people who are being put into the trial from getting hydroxychloroquine, but everybody else so far can still have it, and we'll reinvestigate. It turned okay. Then back a couple, let's go 2 or 3 weeks back, the NIH issued its set of guidelines. This was mostly Fauci's NIAID for the treatment of COVID-19. And they panned hydroxychloroquine and were big on remdesivir. Cheryl Atkinson looked up the committee, and then I did too as a result, and found that 16 of the people on this guidelines committee had either a current, about half of them had a current relationship with Gilead, the manufacturer of remdesivir, and about another half of them had a former financial relationship with Gilead, and that none of them had a relationship with the generic manufacturers of hydroxychloroquine. So all this was interesting. And then, as a result of the WHO's statement last weekend, 3 countries in Europe said they were going to tell their doctors to stop using hydroxychloroquine in COVID patients. And the FDA said they were going to reconsider in the US. Okay, then things, well, I had read that Lancet article. I hadn't even read it through, and I read the first couple of pages, and I said, this is garbage. These people claim to have this database. First of all, they don't give you any information about it. If you look at, it's supposedly a commercial database owned by one of the co-authors, who's a physician, but nobody had heard of this database before. There's an electronic database with 671 hospitals on 6 continents, and nobody knows about it. Nobody ever heard of it. And the mortality rate in their overall was about 11% in those hospitals. Yet in the United States, the mortality rate has been about 20%. In China, it's been about 33% in hospital mortality. So I didn't believe the data. This week, a number of people have weighed in on that study. Remember, it's published. Now, this is the biggest study ever. It's all retrospective, and it's retrospective data. It's observational data, but it had this huge impact. When the Director General of the WHO was asked, why did you halt your trial? Why are you, why is this happening? He said, because of this Lancet article. The Lancet article, we were so worried about these deaths. So then they asked the Director General of WHO, okay, what about people who've been on hydroxychloroquine for lupus, malaria, or rheumatoid arthritis? He said, oh, safe for them, fine for them. They shouldn't stop. It's no good for COVID patients. So anyway, people have blown up the Lancet article, and 180 something scientists have written a letter to the editor pointing out all sorts of methodologic problems and problems of data veracity. So in my opinion, it's almost certain that the person who owns this database made up the data, and the database likely does not even exist. That the company only has 5 employees. How could you manage a database company with 671 hospitals with 5 employees? It's just not possible. So, so that is what's happening now. But it is a wedge to come to understand the amount of effort that has been put into co-opting the WHO, the NIH, the NIAID, all to stop people using hydroxychloroquine, which in the countries or places that do use it, doctors say is quite effective. Not 100% effective, but Didier Raoult says we have a less than 1%. mortality rate in the patients in whom we use this. And this was what was said in a premier hospital in Turkey. Less than 1% mortality rate, in-hospital mortality rate when we use hydroxychloroquine early versus a 20% mortality rate in US hospitals. So this is a big deal. And it's a very interesting way into how things now are done in the medical industrial complex, how medical journals may be corrupted, how these institutions and how the WHO are likely corrupted, and how this whole thing was made to happen. I mean, presumably some public relations firm put it together, but who knows? All right, I'm done.
Thank you, Meryl. That was highly informative, an insider view of how things actually work with these public relations statements by the prestigious people who get all the mainstream coverage. And we have some more along those lines from Thomas Wilcuts. He's an attorney who has a science background and has been involved in science-related cases. And he has spotted even more problems with this Lancet and Nature Medicine claim that the novel coronavirus is natural and not artificial. So go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, Kevin. So I had someone bring to my attention the claim that the scientists had determined that the COVID virus occurred naturally and had not come about through a laboratory, which for me, to make that determination as quickly as it was claimed to be made when the virus had just been mapped out and so forth, seemed ambitious, particularly when you consider you're proving a negative. You're proving that something didn't happen, that it wasn't created in a lab. So that caught my attention, and because of, again, a friend brought that to me and we debated it. Because I looked at the Nature Medicine magazine to see what it is that they actually could prove, and it was clear to me they hadn't proven anything. So the claim that they had made this proof was a deception. It was a deception that was perpetrated in the media, and the scientists involved in that article, it seemed obvious that they were cooperating in that deception and enhancing it. So yes, I'm a trial attorney by profession, but I do have a degree in biophysics. So that includes 4 years of physics, a year of physical chemistry, organic chemistry, biology, and biochemistry. So one thing is, with that background, I did get pulled into quite a few scientific cases over the years. And when as an attorney, when you're handling a scientific case, you ultimately have to explain it to a lay jury. So my job, as I saw it, was to take a potentially complicated matter and try to simplify it. And I want to quote from Richard Feynman, one of the United States all-time best physicists, who said, "If you cannot explain something in simple terms, you don't understand it yourself." And I think that's a very good observation. And when I used to tutor, it's something that I always found true. No matter how complicated something is, actually, forgetting how complicated it is, if I couldn't explain it to a person of average intelligence, that says something about me, not about the person of average intelligence. So I'm going to try to simplify this question of the COVID virus and whether or not there was any proof as to whether it's from a lab or not from a laboratory. So there's basically three possibilities concerning the virus in this respect. One is, as it's claimed, and as Barry Kissin indicated, he thinks the way to the science favors, which is that it evolved naturally. The second possibility is that you can actually engineer a virus, by picking and choosing whatever genetic material you want to choose, and then engineer that material, splice it together in a laboratory. And the third possibility, though, is something that's called, which is what Professor Boyle was talking about when he said gain of function. Gain of function is a phrase that is used to describe a technique by which you help a virus along to evolve naturally. So when the scientists say that, well, we believe this evolved naturally, they mean there was natural mutations in the animals that then took a benign virus and made it a lethal virus for humans. So anyway, so there's the evolved naturally, there's the bioengineering, but the third possibility is that you help the mutation along. So you take a naturally occurring virus and you pass it through various animal cultures in a way that is designed to create mutations artificially. You help them along versus they're occurring naturally in nature. So I have an analogy that I'm going to use to help explain that. So if you consider a river or stream that has a particular flow direction. Now, over time, things can happen. There can be natural dams or there can be erosion, whatever, to where the path of the river is diverted into a new direction. So if you consider that possibility that can happen naturally, then you find a river that does then change direction. So we have the same possibilities that we have with this virus. One is that you can engineer a canal, an artificial canal, in which you can tell that things have been dredged, there's concrete sides to it and so forth. And it's very easy to spot that this was engineered by man. The other possibility is it happened naturally. But the third possibility is that you do something to help nature speed up what it otherwise might have done naturally. You dam up part of the river. And so, or you, you do something to induce erosion. There's any number of things that can happen naturally, you just speed them up. So basically, when they look at this virus, what they're doing is they're looking downstream and they're saying, we don't see any dredging, we don't see any concrete, we don't see any evidence that man created this new strain. But if you're using these techniques that nature uses, like a dam or accelerating erosion or whatever, downstream, you're not going to be able to identify that whether it occurred naturally or whether man did something to help it along. So those are the two possibilities with this gain of function that Professor Boyle talks about. I do agree with Barry that Professor Boyle did not come up with anything like a proof of which it had occurred. But when the Nature article set out to contradict him, and if you look at the timing of these articles, it was clear to me that the Nature Medicine article was designed to address the opinion of Dr. Boyle, who's a renowned expert in bioweapons and who got published in a major British newspaper, that this Nature article came very quickly after that. So the thing about the Nature article is they say, oh, no, he's entirely wrong. We've looked at this and this virus was not engineered. Clearly, we can look at the virus and see that there wasn't any dredging, there isn't any concrete sides, there isn't this stuff to show that it was purposefully engineered. But again, but in doing so, they completely ignore the more likely possibility, which is that this gain of function technology was used. And that is, in the laboratory, you do things to accelerate a natural mutation. You take the virus and you put it in cell cultures in which you're basically telling the virus, in this cell culture, the only way this virus is going to survive is if it adaptively mutates for this new cell culture. And you walk the virus through these various cultures until you get to human tissue to where it effectively infects humans. This is the technology. Now, this technology, in fact, is very controversial. because in 2011, scientists using this technology created one of what's universally regarded as the most dangerous virus that it's ever been on this planet. They took the avian flu virus that doesn't transmit through human. If you put the virus into a human, they die at over 50% rate. But if that human has the virus, they're not going to pass it to another human. So what these scientists did in a laboratory is they turned this virus, deadly virus that can't be transmitted, to one that can. And this was a big controversy because the scientists agreed that if this virus were released in the population, there would be millions of deaths. So a couple of years after that, the CDC announced that there had been some inadvertent laboratory escapes of deadly pathogens, which included smallpox, this avian flu virus that we had artificially made deadly, and anthrax. And because of these laboratory mishaps, in 2014, the Obama administration suspended all gain-of-function research. They suspended this type of research where we accelerate mutations ourselves and we can ourselves create a deadly virus. Now, the reasons that this research, the excuse for this research being done in the first place is that we don't want to sit back and have a virus evolve naturally and get caught off guard, and we don't have any way of defending ourselves. So we're going to actually create the monster ourselves so we can then study it safely in a lab, and we can create the drugs and the vaccines to protect ourselves from it. So this is the excuse for this research. But the risk is that a virus that may never come about, you create yourself, and you create a pandemic. So this was the entire controversy about this type of research, that if you allow this research to occur, that man himself creates the pandemic. Now, this is what Professor Boyle said he believed occurred. And he doesn't say whether it came out of the laboratory by accident or intentional. I think his theory is that it was accident. But either way, the question is, did this? So the research was shut down in 2014, but it was resumed in 2017. And then the question becomes, did this dangerous research, which we shut down for 3 years because of the risk of creating a pandemic, did this research create this pandemic? Now, that is a legitimate question to ask. In fact, it's an important question to ask because it's a good question whether this research exists at all. So the Nature article comes out and says, oh, no, these conspiracy theorists are all wrong. We've debunked this. This virus was not engineered. And they completely ignore the principal way in which you would engineer it, which is gain-of-function research. As Dr. Merrill indicated, Dr. Nass, Merrill, as Dr. Nass indicated, no, I forgot what she indicated, but in any case, so you know, the question is did this gain a function? I'm sorry that they said that, you know, we don't think this happened. And they said it so in such a confused, cryptic way. They didn't honestly address the issue. They said, yeah, we didn't see this in the literature, so you know, we don't think it happened. That's not a defense at all. There are so many interests in this kind of research, billions and billions of dollars involved. If it were shown that this virus is a result of this research, the number of people who would be affected by that, it's extraordinary. So you can't simply say that we didn't read about it anywhere, so this is not a possibility. That's not an honest argument. So in any case, and so Barry says when he reads the Lancet letter of the scientists who get together and say, hey, this is wrong, we shouldn't blame anybody, all the scientists are trying to help, we all need to come together, we agree with our Chinese doctors and scientists, we're all just trying to do good. Well, you know, the question is, are you protecting a form of research that presents a real danger? And I was waiting for Barry to say, being a critic of bioweapons research, I was waiting for him to say that he believed that gain-of-function technology and research should be banned. And if he believes that, then you can't dismiss the notion that this research created this virus. Clearly, that it's a known risk of that kind of research. And here's what happened on this particular lab, okay? So in 2014, the United States shut down funding of this research. However, the NIAID, Fauci's division of the National Institute of Health, funneled money to the Wuhan lab to study bat coronaviruses through a nonprofit organization. So during the time when the United States would not fund this kind of research, funding went to that Wuhan lab for that very purpose. On top of that, in 2018, the United States health personnel inspected this lab and they cabled back to DC that we are very concerned about the security of this lab, that this lab could be at risk for creating a pandemic. Now that might have, you know, I know how you feel about this, Kevin, and that might have been creating the backstory to blame China for releasing this virus. But irrespective, the whole idea that there's all this focus on how dangerous this research is for an intense period of time, and then for our government scientists and the media going along with them to say, what are you talking about? You're just conjuring up a conspiracy theory. And we have this article that shows you that. That article doesn't show anything. You know, I'm going to read, there was, after that article was printed, there was a paper that came out of Australia that provided further evidence that this virus did not occur in nature. And the evidence was that the virus was more effective than the animals that they thought it came from. So that was the evidence. But the doctor who did this research, who's Professor Petrovsky at the, I don't have his, he's at a university in Australia. And I'm gonna quote him. He said, certainly our and other analyses of the genomic sequence of the virus do not reveal any artificial gene inserts that would be the hallmark of gene jockey genetic engineers who manipulate or even create viruses by splicing in artificial inserts into the genome. These are generally easily recognizable and hence clear signatures of human intervention in the creation of a virus. The fact that these artificial inserts are not present has been interpreted by some to mean that this virus is not the result of human manipulation. However, this logic is incorrect, as there are other ways in which humans can manipulate viruses, and that is caused by natural selection. What he means is they spur along natural selection in the gain-of-function technique. So basically what this doctor is saying, hey, look, just because you don't find that this waterway was dredged up and has concrete siding and all this sort of stuff doesn't mean that we didn't create this waterway. We have other ways to create it that make it look like that it replicates what you see in nature. So that's how I'll close. It's, as a person with a background in science, it's insulting for me to watch the media take a scientific question and just so distort it to the public so that they, instead of educating the public on an important scientific point that citizens need to understand, to be good citizens and make good judgments, the media participates in a deliberate deception. There's no question that to say that science has proven that this thing wasn't created by man is clear, deliberate deception. That's what I'll end it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Excellent presentation. And actually, it would strike me as logical that if this virus did show the equivalent of the concrete spillway, that is the obvious gene inserts and so on, it would actually be evidence that it was accidentally released, because as Dr. Merrill Nass and others have pointed out, any deniable germ weapon, and the whole purpose of using germ weapons is that they are deniable and plausibly deniable, it would never be deliberately used that way, except maybe in a very, very extreme circumstance. However, deniable germ weapons created by the gain of function research are another matter entirely. And if that's the type of thing we're looking at, it would be actually more likely that it's deliberate, at least equally likely. So,
Can you jump in? May I just...
Sure. Go ahead briefly, Barry, and then we're going to have to get to the Q&A.
All right. I do want to take exception to what Thomas repeated a couple of times. I think Merrill also went along with it in her blog site. The nature medicine people do speak to the possibility of adaptation to passage in cell culture. And it's not just on the basis of that we don't see anything published about that. I'll read precisely what they said. In theory, it is possible that SARS-CoV-2 acquired RBD mutations during adaptation to passage in cell culture, as has been observed in studies of SARS-1. The finding of SARS-CoV-like coronaviruses from pangolins with nearly identical receptor binding domain RBDs, however, provides a much stronger and more parsimonious explanation of how SARS-2 acquired these via recombination or mutation. Now, just to sort of put that in context, let's not forget that what seems to be quite established is that COVID-2, from a genomic point of view, is 96% identical to a coronavirus found naturally in bats, 96%. The remaining 4% evidently relates to the ability of SARS-2 to attach to human cells. This Nature Medicine article comes along and says, yes, but we see this ability to attach to human cells as naturally occurring in the pangolin. And therefore, they do not offer this as proof. I don't see any claim on their part they've got proof, but they do say that it makes more sense to us, and I think for good reason, that this happens between the bat virus and the pangolin virus as a matter of either recombination or mutation. Let me make this one point that probably a lot of listeners don't realize. Gain of function mutations happen all the time in viruses, natural mutations that generate gain of function. And yes, so that's key. I mean, just because you have gain of function, which is what the original Nature article reported that Francis Boyle seized upon, doesn't mean we're talking about engineering. The gain of function, in fact, that the Nature people had in mind that Boyle relies on is precisely gain of function that happens as the result of natural mutation. I do want to take Tom up on the invitation to enunciate the position. I am totally against gain of function research. I think it needs to be banned, absolutely. I think one of the things we need to learn from this pandemic, without relying on conspiracy theory, is that these hundreds of biolabs that leak all the time are very dangerous, and they pose much more of a risk than a remedy. Thank you.
So
Okay,
Barry,
thanks, Barry.
if it were disclosed that this pandemic was caused by gain of function research, that might eliminate that and you'd get your goal that you want. But if the people who have an interest in maintaining that research get together and say, we're going to agree to tell the public that this is not what happened, then they protect their little project. And what you quoted from that article was not an argument at all. All you said is that this could have happened naturally. That's the quote you gave was, this could have happened naturally. Yes, it could happen naturally.
Thomas,
But-
you're leaving something out. You're leaving something out. We start with 96% identical to a natural germ that arises in bats. We then go and look at the RBDs that have something to do with the ability to attach to a human cell. And they find precisely those RBDs naturally in pangolins.
But you're missing the key. You're still missing. There's two gain of function steps for this virus. One is supplied by the pangolin. That is to attach to the human cell. It attaches, but it doesn't have the cleavage to get into the cell. So that's the second gain of function, and they have no explanation for that at all.
Well, no,
Okay?
they do. No, they do. I mean, they do have an explanation, and they do associate it with a natural evolutionary process, which you can't prove against, and nobody can. I don't think.
No, but look, you're talking about a completely two random events, which is much more unlikely than if you're trying to unrandomize them. Okay, so look, it could happen either way. But when an important scientific group gets together and says, no, it didn't happen this way, that should tell you something, because they're lying.
We have a comment. We have a question. Oh, Ron, you want to go ahead? But we have a questioner who's pointing out that the scientific community's response to 9/11 demolitions shows that a dominant voice in the community will just not go there and will continue to parrot the most absurd science. Go ahead, Ron.
Oh, okay. It seems to me, again, I have no background in microbiology, and I think the argument that Barry Kissin is making is a perfectly valid argument that could be natural, perhaps somewhat improbable, but could be natural. But what I see, on the other hand, is the background of the politics of it. In other words, it seems to me what seems to have happened is that there was a propaganda first strike directed against China very early in the whole event, basically in January. With regard to Francis Boyle and some of these other people, there was an attempt to portray China as having been the creator of a bioweapon that then was accidentally released in China. Now, the reason for that, from a propaganda point of view, is first of all, it deflects to the more logical argument. And second of all, it means that basically those people who want to avoid a dramatic world conflict with China would have a tremendous incentive for arguing that it was not a bioweapon. In other words, I could see a lot of scientists who have mixed feelings on the science being very worried of all this propaganda going out that a Chinese bioweapon was released, and therefore tilting their coverage in some of these academic journals so as to argue that no, it's entirely natural. In other words, the thing is, if not for that attempt to portray this as a bioweapon released by China, I think people would have had a much more objective view of the data. But I mean, if the issue is either it's a natural event or it's a Chinese bioweapon, you could imagine a lot of scientists basically attempting to argue that, oh, it must be natural or that sort of thing.
Okay, that's a good point. We have people with their hands up, so let's go ahead and get to them. We have, I think if your hand's up, I have to say your name and you're going to be on camera. So John Miranda is first in line, and then we have Greg Felton next. So let's go to John, and let's see if we can bring him up. Let's see, I don't see his picture yet, but it should be popping up shortly. Let's see, Alan, are you bringing John up?
There he is.
Looks like, hey, hi, John. Hello, John.
He's got
There he is.
unmute.
Yes, there you are.
Yes.
Hello?
We see your picture, John. Say hello.
Okay. Hello?
Hello. So ask your
Hello.
question.
Okay, just kind of to sum it all up, if you assume that the pandemic provided the opportunity for the Fed to expand their sphere of influence by, say, $23 trillion by making essentially the entire Western world beholden to them through purchase of their stock and loans, et cetera, et cetera. The Fed then actually becomes the de facto government of the Western world because he who has the gold has the power. So the question again becomes, as I was warned, that Germany was the dress rehearsal for the US, and looking at the PNAC documents, this is the time for that dress rehearsal to go live. And certainly 9/11 provided the first cut in our liberties, and it was the first step, the first milestone. But this pandemic actually provides the transmission for a financial coup. And actually that occurred on March 18th when Mnuchin gave Powell unlimited liquidity. Okay, so unlimited liquidity means just that, and it means the Fed becomes $23 trillion richer by printing money out of thin air and charging interest on it.
It sounds like you're supporting my conspiracy theory.
Absolutely.
Now, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Doesn't it seem reasonable that this pandemic is simply the opportunity for a coup, for a transition, for a financial coup for the Fed to become the most powerful entity on the planet, as Meyer Amschel Rothschild said 300 years ago? Give me control of nations, but now planets' monetary supply, and I care not who makes the rules, because I, the banker, am the most powerful entity in that sphere of influence.
My answer to your question is my answer to your question is yes. Any other panelists have any answers?
I'd like to answer the question. Yes, the banksters are taking advantage of this crisis. Does that prove that they engineered the crisis? Certainly not. I haven't read Naomi Klein's book. Maybe some people have. But of course, her thesis is that crises do arise naturally. And because of the terrible power structure we have in this world, those crises get taken advantage of. And we're clearly seeing that in response to COVID-19. Does that prove a conspiracy at the inception? Certainly not.
I agree 100% with what Barry Kissin just said.
Okay. Care to elaborate?
Well, again, you can add an infinite number of moving parts and complexities to anything like that. In other words, you can basically say that you can add so many different conspiracies and that sort of thing. But I mean, basically, in most situations, the simplest explanation is most likely correct. And by the way, with regard to something that Barry Kissin had said earlier, which I, probably should address, I would argue it obviously any half reasonable, half rational government would never have launched a biological warfare attack of this type under any circumstances. And, under those situations, you can certainly rule out that possibility of the sort that I'm addressing. The point is, though, when we look at what has happened to the United States right now, that 100,000 Americans have already died, our entire economy has been wrecked, all of these disasters have taken place. I think that clearly demonstrates we do not have a half competent, half rational government. In other words, they prove that they're incompetent. And so under those circumstances, for a totally incompetent government to take the incredibly reckless step of launching a biowarfare attack against China, and Iran is less implausible than if the government were reasonably competent and reasonably rational.
Good point. 9/11 was pretty reckless too. So we have Greg Felton waiting in line with his hand up. Let's see if we can bring on Greg, and probably take a few moments. But I do agree with you, Ron, about trying to focus on the most straightforward and plausible explanation rather than building endless kind of modifications onto a very complex theory. And I may have been guilty of some of that in my presentation, but I think sometimes when we do that, we may still be barking up the right tree. So let's see when Greg pops up. There he is. Hey, welcome, Greg. How are you?
Hello, Kevin. Long time no hear.
Yeah. So you've got a question for us.
Yeah, I'm just, Dr. Merrill Nass may have answered my question, but I want to ask some of the other people up here as well. One of the things that made the coronavirus so contagious is that, as Dr. Boyle had said earlier in an interview with Joseph Mercola, was that what were called furin cleavage sites. Now, for those of you who are not virologists, furin is an enzyme that will cut a protein and make it possible for that protein to become carcinogenic, to become very, very dangerous and lethal. According to Dr. Nass, there are no naturally occurring furin cleavages in the proteins, as she says, in the beta coronavirus. However, there are such cleavages in the one that we have now. So my question is, does this not militate against insisting upon a naturally occurring virus? That inasmuch as one could argue that, yes, there are gain of function changes in nature, yes, this does happen, but is it not stretching credulity to the breaking point to insist that this is all natural when there is a phenomenon within the the novel coronavirus that does not exist in nature, that had to have been done artificially in laboratory? Does this not militate against the natural phenomenon?
I guess that's for Dr. Ness. So, Meryl, do you have an answer for that? I think you need to unmute.
Let me unmute.
Yeah,
Okay.
there we go.
Yeah, no, I think I personally think it's 99.9% sure that this virus or its progenitors was created in a lab. There are too many unusual, more than those two things. There are a variety of unusual things about it. There have the virus that Barry was referring to before, RATG13, is not a full virus. He said it was 96% the same, but actually there's only a little piece of virus. And it only exists in a computer. It doesn't, there's no sample of it in Wuhan or anywhere else. So we don't know if that one exists. There are pieces, so there are pieces, yes, there's a piece of a pangolin virus that looks close to it, and there's a piece of this virus. And then they're finding new viruses that may look, since this started, that may look like it. But how these all mix together at the same time and place is, it can't be explained, okay? Didn't happen in the wet market. That's been established, even the Chinese have agreed. And people can look at the pattern of mutations and see where all this began. And they can say, yes, it began last fall. They can't say it began in Wuhan, but they can say that the number of mutations sort of came out and grew over time. And so you can pinpoint where it started. It was not circulating in humans before last fall. So for all these things to happen very close together that gave it this enormous ability to infect humans is just, hard to believe occurred in nature, particularly because we haven't even talked about this. There's a 20-year history of scientists on many continents doing precisely the kind of work so that they had already identified these spots as being very important spots to mutate. They'd already mutated these spots in labs, in other coronaviruses, or in avian flu virus. They knew, scientists in the coronavirus field knew exactly what these specific mutations were going to do.
Isn't it also the case that, if I'm still on, Kevin, that it was the Chinese scientist Shi Zhengli that we've mentioned earlier that fabricated the entire database for this alleged coronavirus that had 96% conformity with bat virus?
So we don't know that. There's also talk that this was a different virus that she'd pulled out of a cave in 2013. There's current speculation about that, so I don't want to be more specific. I think this is an issue, really, it's a very technical one. I'm not competent to discuss all the mutations. You really need the virologists talking to each other, and I hate this. I'm not trying to pull, rank on anyone, but it's a very technical subject.
Well, it's a good thing we don't have any virologists on with us, or we wouldn't understand a word they said. So we have one more person with their hand up here, and that is Lou Ann McKeefery. So we're going to bring her on. And thank you, Greg. It's always great to hear from you. Lou Ann McKeefery should be popping up here in our window pretty quickly. Seems like miraculously the internet is working well for us today in this very subversive activity that we're involved in. Maybe maybe we're doing something wrong. I don't know why they're not messing with us. Hello, Lou Ann, are you there yet?
Hey there, I am here. Am I heard?
You are being heard and seen.
All right, the scene part is unusual. I usually stay in a folder. Anyway, hello, thank you for taking my call today. I'd like to shift this just slightly to talking about, if we could, the symptoms that the individuals who maybe did or did not have testing. I do have a friend who tested positive, and he was quite sick, as well as his family later on came down with similar symptoms. And when he described to us, they were sick for about 3 weeks, quite sick. And when he described to us how he was feeling, it didn't sound like, well, as he'll put it, I've never been sick like this before, and it definitely felt like something different. The headache was intense, the brain confusion, the neurological problems that they had. He even said that he'd have to make himself a cup of tea, he would have to talk out loud and then follow his own instructions. So I'm wondering if there's anyone who has experience with treating any patients and how that it may be different than some of the other illnesses that we've seen. Then I'd like to add also, in June, it was actually a year ago this week that we were on a cruise to Alaska on the Grand Princess, the one that had the coronavirus incident this winter. And what was interesting, my husband took a tour on that ship. So he did the $150 back end tour. One of the things they're very proud of is that they have a morgue on that ship. And he said that they told him that the other ships did not have morgues, and that they have the largest, most advanced medical facility on that ship with a full-time doctor who is on staff. Interesting. The other was that they had just installed half the ship with the 5G. Now that may not be, I don't really have any indication of 5G, good, bad, anything else. Just thought that was interesting on that ship. Now, there were 12 of us that went on the cruise, and we returned healthy. Within 2 hours of returning, we were all sick. We were sick with the worst headache we had ever felt, etc. And we stayed sick. So this is 12 of us now. We stayed sick for 3 weeks with a cough and a cold and a headache.
I'm sorry, what was the date?
Around.
I'm sorry, what was the date?
Well, this was June. Let's see, we left May 25th and we returned June 10th. We returned about 3 p.m. to my house here in the East Bay of San Francisco area. We had lunch together. The rest of the group left. And within a couple of hours, my husband and I were sick. And basically went to bed that night and didn't come out of bed except to watch black and white TV for 3 weeks. I just put that out there that we did have quite a, sorry about the hand in front. We did have quite an illness we had never experienced before. We had been on that ship.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay,
we'll just put
so
a period there. But I wanted to get into the
treated
symptoms.
one person, and the stories about the illness vary a lot. So some people have a very short illness, and many people have a prolonged illness that could be 3 or 4 weeks or longer. And they found shedding a virus may go on for up to 6 weeks, and maybe in certain cases longer. But I don't think last year, as far as I can tell from everything I've read, there was no corona, none of this existed a year ago. So I don't think that's what you had. What else? Oh, there were 2 things I wanted to say that I forgot to say earlier. One is that there are lab accidents all the time in all of these high containment labs. So in the United States, there's a program called the Select Agent Program, which is that there's been about 60 organisms designated by the CDC or the USDA as worrisome for basically for causing pandemics or spreading. So biological warfare or dangerous to the food supply or to humans. And if you have a lab and you want to work on one of these 60 pathogens or summer toxins, you have to be part of the Select Agent Program, and you have to do it in a BSL-3 or a BSL-4 lab by law in the United States. There are about 270 labs that are registered with that program, and they must report accidents. And approximately 200 accident reports per year go to the Select Agent Program, okay? 200 potential escapes, 200 times, usually when a worker is exposed to an organism they're not supposed to be exposed to. About 200 times, almost all of these required some sort of medical attention. Not that the person got sick, but that a medical person was called in to sort of look over the exposure. My point is, and there have been many examples throughout history that, old history or new history, of lab workers leaving labs, and getting sick. SARS, the first SARS, has escaped from labs in Beijing, in Singapore, and Taiwan 6 times. 6 separate times they had SARS cases outside of labs in those 3 countries. So when we know about them, most of these escapes we don't know about. But so you have to realize that that is just something that's expected. And when people claim that, oh, this Wuhan lab was dangerous, well, I mean, the NIH, the CDC, and Fort Detrick labs have had lots of these reports. They have had lots of escapes of different kinds. So they're all dangerous to a point. China has said in response to this epidemic, just as we did in response to 9/11, that they're now going to expand their BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs. They actually have a BSL-4 in Harbin also that is active, and they're going to create a number more BSL-3s and 4s. I forgot the last thing I was going to say. That's enough.
Okay, great points, Meryl. And by the way, there's this book, Germs Gone Wild. I don't know if people can see it here, by Kenneth King, which is a very good piece on the crazy accidents and escapes that have happened all over the United States with this massive biowar complex that we've had since the anthrax affair. Okay, we've got 4 people here waiting with their hands up, waiting to ask questions, and we technically we've already run out of time, but I think we can extend it a little bit. So maybe we should start with the people who haven't spoken yet. Dave Schlesinger is the first in line who hasn't spoken yet. So if Alan, I don't know if you can bring up Dave Schlesinger. David Schlesinger is a well-known figure in the 9/11 Truth Movement, and he's a nonviolence activist, and he should be popping up on our screen here pretty soon. There's so many faces on that screen. I have to scroll around looking for the new one.
Start video.
Hey, yeah, hi Dave. You're
okay, yeah, thanks so much. I have been very concerned about the issue of at some point there being a mandatory vaccine leading to the possibility of chipping. I do need to say that I was the person who basically held the hand of the founder of the Lawyers Committee on 9/11 inquiry, Susan Tompkins, who's a legal secretary, and she committed suicide 3 weeks after the first meeting, and she felt she had been chipped. I actually think she had not been chipped, but she believed she had been chipped. And in James Corbett's 4-part series on Bill Gates, the 3rd part does go into some detail about his work in the third world, where he's been doing vaccines, but he's also developed a chip to be used in ostensibly saying, well, this person's already got this vaccine, so we don't have to give them that vaccine again. And the reason I'm especially concerned about chipping is that in Aaron Russo's video, where he discusses his friendship with Nick Rockefeller, he notes that Rockefeller told him that there are plans to eventually chip everyone so that your bank account has to go through it, and therefore they can make sure no one can become a dissident if they want to be able to buy food. So maybe no one has any comment on this. It's really Corbett's work, but that's why I am particularly afraid of this situation and the likelihood of a pandemic. The right-wing folks who protest against lockdown, they say Bill Gates is a leftist, which is absurd.
Okay, anybody have any comments on the chipping and track and trace and this whole Orwellian surveillance scenario that's being brought in on the back of the COVID crisis in the same way that the Patriot Act and so on came in on the back of 9/11? Anybody on the panel want to address it?
Dave and I were in the same class at college. Hi, Dave.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah. I think contact tracing is important for an epidemic like this one, but it can be done as it's being done in Germany without all the electronics, with a phone call and with personal relationship between the tracer and the tracee. And when you're talking about using everybody's cell phone and, it doesn't need to be done that way. And I think that's what we should be fighting against, rather than fighting against something that may actually be very useful at controlling the epidemic. Another thing I wanted to point out is that the federal agencies, specifically the CDC, but also, NIH and FDA went along, prevented us from having any testing for the first 2 months. Until the 29th of February, CDC did not let any private companies, anybody, issue any tests for COVID. So basically that guaranteed that the virus spread throughout the population. And, finally, when everybody was going nuts about this, FDA came in and said, okay, we'll allow companies to come in and get an EUA, and then we will allow them to do a test. But we had a 2-month delay where CDC told them basically, we're going to make the test and you're not going to be allowed to. So they weren't really working hard in development. There were other companies, and WHO had a test. There are other tests around the world, but we were prevented from using it. So I just think it's good to keep that in the back of your mind, that if you're thinking, did the Chinese do it? Did the Americans do it? Well, for some reason, our government was complicit in spreading this thing, in not doing contact tracing, and not using tests that were readily available through the WHO to actually identify where the cases were.
That's very good. Okay.
Okay, and so fighting against case finding now, when it's one way that will help us get back to normal, let's get clear on what kind of case finding will be okay.
Okay, so contact tracing is not necessarily evil and Orwellian. Another question coming from David Rold. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And let's see if we can bring him up. He hasn't spoken yet. And then we have two more well-known figures who have spoken, who've already asked questions, who want to ask more. So let's start with David. And there he is. I see his little screen popping up. David, can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I hope you can. Oh,
You're
great.
coming through loud and clear.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking my question and for doing this conference. So, I mean, to me, it's like really obvious that this whole thing was engineered, that this whole crisis was engineered by the U.S. deep state, by elements here, and this biological aspect, it's like only one part of it. Like the other main part is the mass mind control aspect, like putting everybody into fear and getting us to act in this abnormal way where we're all staying home or wearing masks or staying 6 feet away from people and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm disappointed that you're not challenging questioning whether this fear is justified, and all the guests have like, nobody has disagreed that this virus is really so deadly and so contagious, because that's not very clear. Like, it's not clear that 100,000 people in the US have been killed by the virus. I think they're counting anybody who dies of anything as dying of COVID-19. They're counting people who haven't been tested as dying of COVID-19. They're counting people in their 80s in nursing homes who like were dying anyway and would have died from anything as dying of COVID-19. Sure. And so, they're counting, and the tests, like, I don't think I've seen that the tests aren't accurate. So they're counting false positives. And like one of your guests like mentioned the hydroxychloroquine that they're trying to stop, like an effective treatment, but there's also the ventilators. They're using the ventilators as treatment, and that's killing people. It's not the right treatment.
Yeah. So this is a new disease, and doctors didn't know how to deal with it, and they were very frightened of it. They're frightened of catching it. They weren't given PPE. That was another very peculiar thing that the government seems to have done wrong, whether they did it deliberately or not. And doctors have these crazy protocols. I don't really understand how that has happened to medicine, but they were following protocols, and those were not the best protocols for people with this disease. And I am under the impression that had we started something like hydroxychloroquine and zinc and maybe azithromycin early in the course, we would have way lower rates of people in ICUs and people on ventilators. And now doctors are putting many fewer of these people on ventilators, but it was told to doctors early on that that was what they were supposed to do. In terms of the numbers, we don't know what the numbers are, but I can guarantee you that there's a lot of people who've had this disease because my son is a doctor and my daughter-in-law is a nurse practitioner at a prominent hospital in New York City, and they have dealt with loads of people who have it, and my son caught it at work. And so there's definitely lots of cases in New York. Whether there's up in 100,000 deaths, I can't say, but it seems reasonable to me.
Well,
Whether
it's
we needed to
also,
have that 100,000 deaths is a different question. I think it may be if we had treated differently, and we're still trying to stop this hydroxychloroquine. I don't think we would. I think we could get it under control. But in terms of the overall mortality rate, if you look at all the people who are said to have died from COVID divided by all the people who have tested positive, you get a crude mortality rate of 5.8% in the US, which isn't bad. They're 14% in the UK and 14% in Italy. If you look, however, at population sampling for antibodies, you find that 80 to 90% of the cases are either mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic. They have antibodies already, and that lowers the death rate to between 0.5% and 1%, as Ron Unz said. There's been 4 or 5 recent sero studies that have all converged on that kind of number. So I think it's real.
Okay, and then maybe Ron could respond to David a little bit, because Ron, I know that over at the UNS Review, a leading alternative outlet, you've been engaged in a lot of back and forth with people who have views similar to David's. Maybe you could.
Yes, I guess I can say so. I mean, partly because we tend to be sort of open-minded and we're lightly moderated, we've attracted a vast number of people who claim that the virus is a hoax, or it's just a joke, or it's a conspiracy or something like that. And I really think almost all of that is just nonsense. In other words, based on all, the easiest way to see roughly how many people have died probably from the virus is not to look at, for example, not to look at case rates or things like that, but simply look at the excess mortality. And the New York Times, the Financial Times, lots of publications have gone out there and they've simply looked at the death rate in New York City, or the death rate in New York State, or the death rate in other locations currently in the last couple of months compared to what it was, for example, in the past. And there's a massive spike in death rates, which is probably explained by the fact that there's a deadly virus going around. So most estimates I've seen are that probably the figure of 100,000 dead Americans due to the virus are probably somewhat underreported, and that the true figure might be 20 or 30% higher than that. So I think it's really just absurd to claim that relatively few Americans have died when all the empirical evidence is that there have been huge mortality spikes in different locations in northern Italy, Lombardy, in New York, and other parts of the United States. And I think it's really, I mean, the whole thing is within, I guess, what might be called the conspiracy movement. There are lots of people who look around for every sort of bizarre angle to things, in terms of very complicated pictures, in terms of this, for example, virus not really being nearly as lethal as people make it out to be. And I think I'm really quite skeptical of those arguments. I've really seen no other explanation as to why there are huge mortality spikes in exactly those locations that seem to be undergoing high rates of infection of this disease. And, the figures are probably well over 100,000 dead Americans due to this. Now, admittedly, many of the people who've died tend to be older or have other, illnesses that have made the virus much more lethal to them. But we're still talking about very large numbers of Americans having already died. And unfortunately, probably large numbers will die in the next, over the rest of this year. So I'm very skeptical of the people who claim that the virus is a hoax or fake or a conspiracy or something like that.
Okay, but that said, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a manufactured fear pandemic going around, that the fear and the hysteria isn't being weaponized. We could very well have exactly the death figures that you've stated, and at the same time, a kind of propaganda apparatus with various people spreading mindless fear for their own purposes.
Well, possibly, but I mean, the truth is, let's take the bottom line. I mean, all the available evidence is that this virus seems to have a fatality rate of between 0.5% and 1%. It's also extremely contagious, which means, to give an example, about 2 months ago, there'd been 300 American deaths. Now the figure is over 100,000. So in 2 months, we've gone from 300 deaths to over 100,000 deaths. And given the exponential growth of this virus, unless strong public health measures were taken, social distancing, masks, things like that, it's likely that it would have infected the bulk of the American population. So, herd mortality would be around 60%, 70%. So, we'd be talking about 200 million, 250 million infected Americans, which probably would mean roughly a couple of million deaths. And when we're talking about a virus that in a period of a few months had the potential for killing a couple of million Americans, I mean, that's the sort of thing that induces a lot of fear in people, and rightfully so.
Yeah, sometimes there is something to fear, unlike the Al-Qaeda scare and the ISIS scare. So we have a couple more questions lined up. We have Peter Myers and Barbara Honegger, and that's going to be all we'll have time to take. So let's take the questions from Peter and Barbara, presumably in that order. By the way, people may not realize where everybody is. We're in different locations here, and Peter is all the way over in Australia. And I think it's a kind of ungodly hour over there. It was when this started, so I appreciate his participating. Hey, welcome back, Peter. So what's your next question?
Thank you, Kevin. Can you see me? I
yes,
think you can.
You're here.
I'd like to take up something Thomas Wilcutt's raised, and that is the media is not an impartial umpire in this, but a player. And if you look at the Nature Medicine article to start with, it's unusual in scientific literature because it doesn't, normally scientific literature references opponents. It cites their other publications which it's arguing against. But the Nature Medicine article doesn't mention any of the other literature that it's arguing against. That's one point. Now, secondly, when Luc Montagnier made his statements about this virus, that was in France, and it did get covered in France in the media. It was also reported in the Times of London, but it didn't get reported at all in the mainstream media in the US. I did extensive checks on it, and I even checked site by site, so that, for example, if you do a search on Luc Montagnier coronavirus, and you want to check if the New York Times mentioned it, you add a term to your search called SITE : and then immediately the URL of the New York Times, and you can see exactly what the New York Times has said about it, if anything. And you can also add a time period like last 24 hours, last week, last month, last year. And I did searches on all the mainstream media in the US, and they just didn't mention his statements. Now, the same happened with Nikolai Petrovsky in Australia, who is a vaccine developer. He's recently been lauded for developing an Ebola vaccine. And his statements that Thomas Wilcott's quoted were not reported in the mainstream media. Once again, I did extensive searches immediately after his statements in the next few days, next week. They just didn't show up. The media did mention his Ebola vaccine, but they didn't mention what he said about that. Now, another point is that, look, I missed the first half hour because my alarm clock didn't go off. I don't know if you mentioned this, but there was a lot of collaboration between the University of North Carolina, particularly Rolf Barrick, and Wuhan Institute of Virology. And there's a 2016 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, which it says, the title is SARS-like coronavirus poised for human emergence. And it thanks Zhengli Shi, or Shi Zhengli of Wuhan Institute of Virology, for bat coronavirus sequences and plasmid of coronavirus spike protein. So what they're saying in this article is that they actually used the samples from Wuhan Institute of Virology in these experiments, which were conducted in the United States. Yeah, no, I think.
So do you have a specific question for one of the panelists about that?
Well, well, maybe you can comment on the media's failure to report. See, we've been so far in this discussion, when you've been talking about contrary viewpoints, you've been assuming that both viewpoints have been put in the public media. Now, we in the dissident media, we know the contrary viewpoints, but the mainstream media actually hasn't reported these contrary statements by, say, Montagnier and Petrovsky. So how do you explain? Now, in terms of the factions of you said the deep state, and in particular the neocon faction has done this. And but if you look at the World Health Organization and Bill Gates and John Hopkins, they're all globalist faction. And I can't imagine that the globalists unleashed this virus because it would have shot globalization down. So they couldn't have unleashed it. But on the other hand, you're more or less saying that the neocons unleashed it. Maybe the globalists developed the thing that the neocons unleashed. I think that's the sort of thing you're saying. But in terms of factions, the only logical faction that could have done it would be people like Pompeo, people like him, But on the other hand, Israel's Netanyahu is cozying up with China. It doesn't really fit your case all that well.
Well, thank you, Peter. We could go in a long discussion, and it's fairly theoretical and speculative, I think, when we get into these factions of the deep state. And I'm a bit skeptical about this notion that there's a complete difference between those factions. That is the notion that there's a globalist faction that wants to peacefully globalize and have a sort of a free trade driven one world. And then there's a hardcore militarist faction that wants to conquer the world militarily. I think they're all on the same page. And as John Perkins says, once again, in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, they use both debt and trade on the one hand, and then military force as on the other, in their effort to grab as much wealth and power as possible and ultimately try to set up a one world state. And no territorial expansion in history, maybe with very, very few exceptions, in which a state has gotten more territory, controlled more territory, has ever happened except through military conquest. And so I don't think there is any faction that imagines that it could do it any other way except for utopians like us. But the people who are actually running things, I think, know that they're running a full-scale war on many fronts that involves all sorts of different strategies. But ultimately, it's a military strategic equation that dominates. But that's the best I can do there. Anyone else on the panel want to respond to Peter?
Yes, Kevin. So Peter mentioned Professor Petrovsky, who works out of Flinders University in Australia. And he did come out with the research to contradict the Nature Medicine article. And what Peter said is he didn't find that discussed in media outlets. I found it, I'm pretty sure that I found it in the New York Post, Washington Times, and the Daily Mail, which again was typical, as I state in my paper, that the right-leaning outlets seem to be more willing to tell these stories, and the mainstream, CNN, New York Times, and so forth wouldn't touch them. The other interesting thing about Petrovsky's findings, and Dr. Nasso appreciate this, is that when the Nature Medicine article came out, the director of the NIH, Dr. Collins, really pounded his chest in saying that the conspiracy theories, the outrageous conspiracy theories had all been debunked. This clearly evolved in nature. So when Petrovsky came out with his study, the NIH was contacted for comment on the study, and their media director said, "Oh, it's not our position to get involved in these debates." Well, someone should have told the director of the NIH that when he, pounded his chest in triumph over the Nature Medicine article, and then when it got contradicted by Dr. Petrovsky, they said, "Oh, that's not a part of what we do to get involved in these."
Let me talk a little bit about these people, the 5 who wrote in Nature Medicine, and Petrovsky both relied on modeling, mathematical modeling of the strength of the receptor binding domain to humans as opposed to other animals, Petrovsky. So Petrovsky did a mathematical model on a computer and said the binding is stronger than to all the other animals we know about in this coronavirus's receptor binding domain. But basically the people in Nature Medicine said the same thing with their modeling. They just had a different theory for how that might have taken place. They mentioned that passage was a possibility, but then they sort of ignored it and went on. So, but what you have to realize that whenever you're doing modeling, it's math, if you put garbage in, it's garbage out. So the NIH doesn't really have to respond to the fact that you made a model and your model predicts thus and so. They have to actually, respond to experimental evidence from more than one place.
And
but when they embraced the Nature Medicine article, Dr. Collins specifically embraced that computer modeling as supporting their thesis.
Yeah, well, he didn't even talk. Yeah,
he did.
He didn't even talk about what was said in the article. He just said this should be the last word on it, and there should be no more conspiracy theories about the origin of SARS-CoV-2. So clearly, it seemed to me that he probably didn't even write the blog post. I don't know if these scientists actually wrote this Nature Medicine article, because some of it is very logical and has good information, and some of it is utter crap. So I think this was a cover story, and the director of the NIH's blog was a cover story, and the Lancet letter was a cover story. And so who really wrote them? Who got the signatures together? We don't know all that.
And if I can interject here, it seems to me with regard to the media coverage, there are 3 separate possibilities really that reasonably could be involved with this virus.
There's the anti-Trump angle.
No, three possibilities. 1, it's a natural virus that simply appeared when it did. 2, it's a Chinese biowarfare virus that was accidentally released by the lab. Or 3, it's an American biowarfare virus. Now, the whole thing about it is all the media coverage has been on the first 2 possibilities, arguing back and forth. In other words, the bulk of the media coverage has been, the established media coverage has been that it's a natural virus. However, you have Pompeo, you have Senator Tom Cotton, you have Trump himself, you have a lot of the right-wing pro-Trump people in the last few months saying, no, it's a Chinese biowarfare weapon released by the laboratory. And there has been no coverage of what is the much more logical 3rd possibility, that it was an American biowarfare virus, simply because it hit China, it hit Iran. It hit China at exactly the point in time that was worst for China, right before the Lunar New Year, which means basically it was very unlikely to have been an accidental release by their lab. I mean, the likelihood, if you look at it, it hit China in probably the worst 10-day or 30-day period of the year. The likelihood of an accidental lab release hitting China at exactly that point is 5%, 2%, 3%, something like that. And the likelihood of then hitting the political elites of Iran right immediately afterward is also very low. Furthermore, you do have that report published by the Defense Intelligence Agency describing this cataclysmic disease outbreak taking place in Wuhan. And the report was published before the cataclysmic disease outbreak had taken place, while it was probably 5 people or 10 people or 20 people in a city of 11 million, and the Chinese government wasn't aware of it. I mean,
Ron, I haven't seen that report. What are you referring to?
You can look at my article. It was the report was described in ABC News, a very mainstream source. In other words, what really is remarkable about this issue is I tend to always focus on mainstream elite sources because they're much more reliable than conspiracy fringe people. We're talking about ABC News disclosing the release of the report based on 4 separate intelligence sources.
Okay, this is the article, but it says it only started in November. And it started in
Exactly.
Wuhan.
The whole thing is basically the report came out in November. The Defense Intelligence Agency.
No, the report came out in April. And it talks about a November report, but then it also has some intelligence group that denies that the report exists.
Exactly. But then Israeli media disclosed the fact that the report had been sent to Israel in November. In other words, what happened was there were 4 separate intelligence sources that went.
Okay, but that's still the second half of November, which is consistent with what the Chinese say, which is that their first guy got it on about November 17th. He got sick.
Right, but that's one person. In other words, the Defense Intelligence report was talking about a cataclysmic disease outbreak taking place in Wuhan. And the point is...
Exactly. But it may be a cover story too, and the Israelis could have been part of it.
Right, but what I'm saying is basically what we have is ABC News, basically 4 intelligence sources reporting that the US had distributed a report to all of its NATO allies and to Israel about this terrible disease outbreak taking place in Wuhan in November. And that was before more than probably 5 or 10 people in all of Wuhan were infected.
Although we don't really know. Because there's individuals who have infected 60 other people, and there's plenty of individuals who have infected nobody. And the infectivity may be changing over time.
Based on
at this point, we don't know how many people in Wuhan when.
But here's the key thing. What is the likelihood that American intelligence would have been aware of the outbreak before the Chinese government was aware? There's absolutely no evidence that the Chinese government was aware of it before right at the end of December or early January.
Biological warfare is something that governments keep very close to their chest, and wherever they are. The other point, Ron, that doesn't fit your theory is the fact that the U.S. government deliberately allowed this to spread through the population for 2 months by withholding testing.
Here's the thing.
And so, explain that.
Oh, it's very simple. I am in no way claiming that Donald Trump in the National Security Council took a decision to launch a biological warfare attack against China or Iran. What I'm talking about is basically rogue elements in the American national security establishment decided to basically cripple the Chinese economy by that attack, and also hit the political elites in Iran.
It was rogue. Hold on a second now. If it was rogue, why would they put it in the report?
It's very simple. Once the virus was probably released at the end of October, the beginning of November. In other words, at the time, the 300 military officers were visiting Wuhan. That was sort of the cover. The point is, once the virus was in circulation, it was perfectly natural. I don't know. I have no idea which elements of the national security intelligence apparatus were involved, but basically, they put out the word that there was a viral outbreak in Wuhan, and that the report was published so that, for example, if to avoid the chance of American military personnel in East Asia being contaminated, they assumed there was a low likelihood of it leaking back into the United States, just as it happened with SARS or MERS. In other words, those epidemics never reached the United States, or I think maybe one person died or something like that. So in other words, we're talking about basically certain elements launching the biowarfare attack against China and Iran. And sorry, go ahead.
They're calling it cataclysmic because it's so contagious. That doesn't jive with what you just said.
Well,
by the way, let me just remind us of what Peter said, because I think the November report certainly deserves attention and is potentially illuminating. I just want to pick up on one thing Peter said, which is curious. He mentioned that in September, China conducted a coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan exercise in September, didn't you, Peter?
Yes, September the 18th.
Well,
It was 1 month before
that's
the beginning of the Wuhan military games.
After.
And they not only had simulated a coronavirus infection, but also nuclear materials as well.
Governments often run drills of all sorts at all different points of time. And I mean, just as you said, for example, I hadn't been familiar with those details, but the fact that they simulated a nuclear outbreak, what does that mean?
Well, the point being that people said that Event 201 went live, you know, as similar drills at the time of 9/11 went live.
I don't put any.
And so that the argument was that if the globalists conducted a drill and it went live, what about the Chinese drill? That was a month earlier.
I've never discussed Event 201 or any of those things. I don't regard that sort of evidence as being.
No, but Michel Chossudovsky did. He said it went live.
You sure did.
That's fine. But what I'm saying basically, look, there are 4 separate intelligence sources. ABC News has confirmed by Israeli intelligence that the Defense Intelligence Agency had distributed a report to all of our NATO allies and to Israel about a cataclysmic disease outbreak taking place in Wuhan in November. If you look at the timelines, for example, of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Associated Press Investigative Unit, all of them have documented the timeline of the epidemic taking place in China. And none of those timelines indicate anybody in China was aware of the epidemic in Wuhan as early as November. Basically, it was late December when people became aware of the outbreak. And given the exponential growth of the virus, it's reasonably clear when the original patient 0 or when the outbreak took place. And it probably would have been right at the end of October, the beginning of November, somewhere in that range. And given the fact that we're talking about a city of 11 million people and exponential growth, and the fact that there were some dozens of infections, I think, by December, it's simply extremely unlikely that anybody in Wuhan was aware of it in November. So in other words, we have the US government, Defense Intelligence Agency, being so certain of this massive outbreak, they distributed the intelligence to all of our allies around the world, according to ABC News, as confirmed by Israeli intelligence. And that occurred before the Chinese government was aware of it, because at that point, there were only a few dozen people infected in the whole city of 11 million people.
Yeah, so certain doesn't quite jive, I don't think. I mean, so certain. I'm sure they distribute reports like this all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean
the cataclysmic outbreaks are coming. I don't know, Barry.
The possibility of a cataclysmic outbreak. I mean, let me point some out. Ron, you just said you don't put any stock in Event 201. What does Event 201 represent, if not previous knowledge? I happen to think you're right. I don't think Event 201 proves anything. But if it doesn't represent previous knowledge, what it represents is a real awareness out there that coronavirus is going to cause us problems. And that real awareness has been out there among very reputable scientists for a number of years. And in fact, all kinds of recommendations were made for preparing against that and were ignored.
But look, we're talking about, according to all the intelligence sources, according to ABC News and Israeli media, the report did not say there could be an outbreak. The report said there is a cataclysmic disease outbreak taking place in November.
Well, you know, Ron, if you could get the reports from November, that would be great. But what we have here is a report from ABC News on April 8th.
Confirmed by Israeli media. They say they got the report from the Defense Intelligence Agency that was distributed to all the NATO allies.
Right, confirmed on 16th of April, not confirmed in November. That's what I'm saying. This could just be
it wasn't
another...
published in the American media in November.
Anyway, let's not be this dead horse anymore.
Intelligence report. It was a secret report distributed to all
it's not the actual
in Israel.
report.
And by the way, it's
just like there are reports of these supposed cables that warned about the dangers of this lab in Wuhan, but nobody's seen the cables either.
And the subtitle was, "It could be a cataclysmic event." It could be a cataclysmic. Not it is, it could be. That was the subtitle.
Nobody in China was aware of it because at that point only a few dozen people had been infected.
We
And
just don't know.
I don't
None
think
of
you
us
know
were
that.
in Wuhan.
But it,
You know,
Well, I think we're gonna have to maybe disagree. In this case, I would agree with Ron that's a kind of extraordinary report in the mainstream media that obviously needs to be followed up on. And if it's not a smoking gun, it's certainly blowing a lot of smoke, and there's probably some fire there. And it's extraordinary that the mainstream media isn't following up on this. I mean,
exactly.
it is so extreme and so
We're talking about
bizarre.
ABC News, and we're
Yeah.
talking about basically something that really is look. Does it prove that there was an American attack? No, but it's incredibly strong circumstantial evidence. I mean, in fact, it is really fairly.
okay. Can we go
Yeah,
on to the?
but-
I think Barbara Honegger has been waiting to ask a question.
yeah. Let's bring on Barbara Honegger. She'll provide our final raise your hand live pictured questioner for our event. And after responding to Barbara, we're going to have to sign off because we've gone quite a ways overtime. So let's see if Barbara's popping up here somewhere. There she is. Or at least there's her box, and I'm sure Barbara will be popping up in her box shortly. So hello, Barbara. Can you hear us? Guess we can't hear her yet.
She's muted.
Can you
Yeah.
hear me? Can you hear
Yes,
me?
we can now. There you are, Barbara.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I do have a question, but because the commentary leading up to my question is about the piggybacking of, or basically taking exercises live, I think that it's important first to note that with regard to the reports of a major outbreak of coronavirus coming from our own DIA, as early as November, before we know that the Chinese government had knowledge of it. That's extremely important. I would, if I were a juror, I would say it's definitely, as we say in the legal world, dispositive. However, I do want to point out that that those reports were given to members of the Senate and presumably also the House Intelligence Committee, who acted on it. And the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee has had to resign from that post because he acted on it and got out of stuff in the stock market
I think
based upon the warning.
he acted on a report in February. He sold stock in February.
Right, but we know that it was based upon a
supposedly
report that was
November.
given. Correct, but we know that it was based upon a report given to him in November.
How do you know that?
Well, I can send you the articles that make that claim. But the other
I read an article that made the claim that he was briefed in February and that, within a couple of days he sold stock.
It's not my understanding, but I'll check it. But in any case, the other major point I wanted to make before the question is that I don't think that we should dismiss so lightly the personal experience of the woman who made a comment on the Q's and A's, who was on the Diamond Princess, I believe was the name, especially because of the similarity of the symptoms. We're talking about, I believe, late June into July of 2019. There's no better place to do a kind of controlled experiment on how a virus, a kind of a test bed, than I can imagine than a cruise ship. That's number one. Number two, I want to remind people that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, standing at the White House in the White House press room next to President Trump, said out loud that the whole coronavirus thing is a quote live exercise, unquote. I think we should take him at his word. Third, if the Chinese did do an exercise on coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, an exercise is an exercise, but we know from 9/11, we know from 7/7 in London, we know from the Boston Marathon that people on the very high up on the inside in our intelligence, military intelligence apparatus, anybody who knows that an exercise is coming and the scenario of the exercise, those are the people that you point the finger to as to who then piggybacks the live attack on top of the exercise as its cover. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now, my question is this, and it was a question I sent to Kevin actually before this event. And that is, I believe this would be for Dr. Nass, but for anyone else who wants to address it. And that is it consistent, assuming that your position, and Dr. Wilcox also, if I understand correctly, the position is that it's more likely that the coronavirus definitely was made in a laboratory, but that it could have been by the so-called old method, World War II and after, where you basically quickly evolve. You have artificial means in the laboratory in the Petri dish to quickly evolve and enhance the rate of mutations to get what you want. Now that's called gain of function. Is that consistent? If it were, quote, just unquote, gain of function processes in a lab that created the coronavirus, whatever lab that was, wherever it was on the planet, is that consistent with my understanding of the Indian research result that there are actually 4, as I understand it, hive-related inserts that require an active, as I understand the language, bioengineering? Or could it be both? Could it be gain of function and bioengineered inserts? That's my question.
Okay, that's the last question. So experts, who wants to address it?
I'm not an expert, but and I did actually type some material to you as well. I think that there's been a lot of confusion over the language, and also there's been confusion about what I wrote back in March and April. I was trying to prove that my interest in that article was to prove the Nature Medicine authors were making an argument, a specious argument that they knew was specious. And I used the example of old methods to point out that the fact that these methods exist was the evidence that they were lying, basically. So I personally believe that it would be much easier to make this particular virus using a mixture of passage and some genetic engineering techniques. But it could be designed a number of different ways, and it probably is a chimera that was taken from various different viruses that have been created and were naturally occurring, and then had some changes made to them. So that's my personal opinion. In terms of these HIV segments, you have to realize they're very short segments. They're I think 6 to 10 amino acids in length, so that there is a possibility that they may occur, just by chance. They also, HIV pseudoviruses were used in some of the in some of the coronavirus research. And it's possible that these bits of HIV entered in that way, but I don't understand exactly what research was done, but we do know it's published that HIV pseudoviruses were used in corona research. And I believe that's why Dr. Luc Montagnier thought that the reason for these HIV sequences being in the virus is that they were doing potentially HIV vaccine research using coronaviruses. The spike, the receptor binding domain, and the furin cleavage site have been looked at really extensively by virologists, and there's a tremendous number of amount of commentary about them on the internet. These little HIV pieces, and there's a lot of prior coronavirus research that was directed and one can look at to explain those particular mutations. One was a mutation, one was a series of mutations. The other was actually an insert of 4 amino acids. But nobody has done that. Look, what the Indians identified and what Luc Montagnier identified has not had that kind of attention by virologists talking on the internet with each other. And so I am not sure whether that is that is going to be, I think it's going to turn out probably to be a clue, but I don't know yet.
The Indians retracted their paper, by the way, very, very soon thereafter. You know, you can say that was corrupt, but not necessarily.
Well,
Okay,
Luc Montagnier, you know, said, well, pressure was put on them. But
Yeah,
Listen,
they
we'll
were-
probably have to leave it there because
Yeah.
we could go back and forth on this for a long time, and I'm sure the experts and near experts will be doing that. But we have gone past our time limit, and it's nearly 5 p.m. here in Central Time. So I want to thank our panelists for what's been a really illuminating presentation. It's been quite extraordinary, really, to hear this level of discussion, which I think is far better than what we hear not only in the mainstream media, but also in most of the alternative media as well. So a big thank you to everybody who's participated in this, to Ron Unz of the Unz Review, and to to Tom Wilcuts, the attorney, and to Meryl Nass and Barry Kissin, and to our people who've intervened. Great questions. It's really been a great event. I think there'll be people who actually want to sit through the entire, what has it been, 4 hours. And thank you to Alan Rees, our producer at No Lies Radio. So good night. God bless. Stay healthy, and maybe we'll be doing something like this again. And if so, we'll try and let you know.